Section 13 of A Dozen Ways to Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dozen Ways to Love by Lily Dougall. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. The Pauper's Golden Day. Betty Lamb was a comely girl. She was big to look at, being tall and strong. She was never plump, and she was never well clothed, not even in the best days of her youth. She had been brought up in the workhouse. After that, she belonged to no one. Her mind was a little astray. She had strong, rude, strange ideas of her own. She would not be humble and work day in, day out like other folk, and for that reason she never throve in the world. She lived here and there and did this and that. All the town knew her. She was just Betty Lamb. No one expected aught of her. It was a small town in the west of Scotland. On different sides of it, long lanes of humble villages straggled out into the fields. The cottages had grey stone walls and red-tiled roofs. There were new grey churches in the town, and big buildings and streets of shops. The people in those days thought these very fine. They thought less about the real glory of the town, a ruined abbey which stood upon an open heath just beyond the houses. 3 walls, 2 high Gothic windows with the slender mullions unbroken, a few stately columns broken off at different heights from the ground, and 1 fragment of the high arch of the nave standing up against the sky in exquisite outline. These formed the ruin. It was built of the red sandstone that in its age takes upon it a delicate bloom of pink and white. It looked like a jewel in the breast of the grey hill country. Firs grew within the ruin and for acres on all sides. Sheep and goats came nibbling against the old altar steps. A fringe of wild flowers and grass grew upon the top of the highest arch and down the broken fragments of the wall. All around, the stately hills looked down upon the town and the ruin, and the sky that bent over was more often than not full of cloud, soft and grey. Betty Lamb was getting on to middle age, about 30, when she had a baby. They had put her again in the poor's house, but she arose when her baby was but a day old, and went away from the place. It was summer-time then. The sky relented somewhat. There was sunshine between the showers, and sometimes a long, fair week of silvery weather, when a white haze of lifting moisture rose ever like incense from the hills, and the light shone white upon the yellow bloom of the firs. Betty Lamb found the ambry niche in the wall of the ruin at the side of the place where the altar had been. She laid her baby there. That was his cradle, and by sunlight and moonlight she was heard singing songs to him. The people were afraid of going too near her at that time. "It is dangerous," said they, "to touch an animal when she has her young with her." As years went on, Betty Lamb and her little boy spent summer after summer upon the moor. The child was not christened, unless indeed the dew falling from the sacred stones and the pity of God for fatherless innocence had christened him. In this world, at least, his name was written in no book of life, for he had no name. He grew up to be a little lithe lad. Then it was that in every pickle of mischief where a little lad could be, this elf child, with his black eyes and curly auburn hair, was to be found. So maddening, indeed, were his naughty tricks, that the townspeople spoke not so often as beating him, as they would have beaten a human child, but of wringing his neck like a young thing that had no right to live. Yet it was more often in word than in deed that punishment of any sort was inflicted, for the preliminary stage was perforce. First catch a boy, and that was far from easy. Even when the catching was accomplished, the beating did not always come. One day the minister of the kirk looked out upon his glebe. His favourite cow, with a bridle in her mouth, was being galloped at greatest speed around the field, Betty's lad standing tiptoe upon her back. The minister, with the agility which unbounded wrath gave him, caught the boy and swung his cane. "I am going to thrash you," said he. "Aye, ye maun do that." The small face was drawn to the aspect of a grave judge. "Ye maun do that. It's your duty." The minister, who had looked upon his intention rather in the light of a natural impulse, felt the less inclination for the task. "Are ye not afraid of being beaten?" he asked. "Aweel," an air of profound reflection. "I'm thinking. I can, even it ony day, wi' riding on a coo's back when she rin like yon." The sunlight of habitual benevolence began to break through the cloud of wrath upon the good minister's face. "If I let you off, laddie, what will you do for me in return?" An answering gleam of generosity broke upon the sage face of the child. "I'll fair teach ye how to do it yourself." The lad grew apace. The neighbours said he showed a caring for his mother, but no one held him a helping hand. They were so sure that no good could come of him or of her. The mother had taken to drink, and one day it was found that the lad had gone, just as he had often slipped from the grasp of one or another of the angry townsmen, dodged, darted, and disappeared for the moment. So now it seemed that he had slipped from the grasp of the town, run quickly, and disappeared. No one knew why he had gone, or whither, or to what end. Betty Lamb remained in the town, a fine figure of a woman, but bowed in the shoulders, dirty and clad in rags. At last, when her strong defiance of poverty and need would no longer serve her, she was seen to go about from door to door in the early dawn, raking among the ashes for such articles as she chose to put in an old sack and carry upon her back. The townspeople honestly thought that all had been done that could be done to make a decent woman of her, and now, in her old age, she must needs go down to the gutter. One day a man came to the town with circus pictures and a bucket of paste. He pasted his pictures upon all the blank spaces of walls which he could find. Great was the joy of the children who stood and stared, their little hearts made glad by novelty and colour. Great was the surprise of the older folk, who said, "It is a new thing in the world, when so great a show as this comes out of the accustomed track of shows to erect its tent in our small town." Yet so it was. From some whim of the manager, or of some one who had the ear of the manager, the thing was decreed. Upon these circus pictures there figured, in a series of many wonderful harlequin attitudes, a certain Signor Lambetti. Very foreign was the curl of his hair and the waxen ends of his moustache. Very magnificent was his physique. He wore the finest of silken tights and crimson small clothes, and medals were depicted hanging upon his breast. When at length the circus came for that one night's entertainment, and the huge tent was set up upon the common, not far from the old red ruin, all the town flocked to see the brilliant spectacle. The minister was there, and what was more, his wife and daughters too. They were far grander than he was, and wore silken furbelows and fringed shawls. The minister paid for the best seats for them to sit in. All the shopkeepers were there. Every man, woman, and child in all the town who could find as much as sixpence to pay for standing room was there. But the strangest circumstance was that before the show began, a man went out from the brightly lit doorway and called in a loud voice to the beggars and little ragged boys and girls who had come to survey the tent on the outside, and he brought them all in and gave them a good part of the tent to sit in, although they had not sixpence to pay, nor even a penny. Ah, in those days it was a very grand sight. There were elephants who performed tricks, and camels who walked about with men and bundles on their back, just as they do in eastern deserts. And there were wonderful ladies who dressed and behaved like fairies, who stood standing tiptoe on the backs of horses and jumped through swinging rings. But the crowd had not read the circus bills and the newspapers from all the neighbouring cities for nothing. They were a canny Scotch crowd. They were not to be taken in by mere glitter. No, not the smallest barefoot boy, nor the most wretched beggar, for they knew very well that the real crisis of the evening was to be the appearance of Signor Lambetti, and the word wonderful was not to be spoken until his feats began to be performed. At length he came outside the curtain, upon which all eyes had long been fixed. The curl of his hair and the waxed ends of his moustache proved him to be beyond doubt from foreign parts. He was indeed a most grand and handsome gentleman. His dress was, if anything, more superb than it had been in the pictures. All his well-formed muscles showed through the silken gauze that he wore. His velvet trappings were trimmed with gold lace, and his medals shone like gold. He walked upon a tightrope away up in the peaked roof of the tent. He held a wand in his hand by which to balance himself, and in the other hand a cup of tea, which he drank in the very middle of his walk, tossing it off, bowing to the crowd below, and bringing the cup and saucer to the other end in safety. The crowd gave deep sighs, partly of satisfaction for being permitted to see so wonderful a sight, partly out of relief for the safety of the performer. "Ay me," they said to one another, "did ye ever see the licht of that?" It meant more from them than the loudest clamour of applause, yet they applauded also. Then Signor Lambetti, looking quite as fresh and jaunty as at first, ascended a small platform, standing out upon it in the full light of all the lamps. He made a little speech to the effect that he was now going to perform a feat which was so difficult and dangerous that hitherto he had kept it solely for the benefit of crowned heads, before whom on many occasions he had had the privilege of appearing. He said, in an airy way, that the reason he did the town the honour of beholding this most wonderful of all his feats was merely that he had taken a liking to the place. "Ay, but he's grand," said the little barefoot boys to one another, as they huddled against the front of the stand allotted to them. "Ay me, but he's grand," and all the rest of the townsfolk said the same to themselves or each other, but they expressed it in all the different ways that dignified caution common to the Scotch. There was a series of swings, one trapeze fixed higher than the other, like a line of gigantic steps to the very pinnacle of the tent. The seigneur announced that he was going to swing himself up upon these hanging bars until he reached the topmost, and from that he would leap through the air down into the lighted abyss below and catch a rope that was stretched at the foot of the grandstand. Merely to hear him tell what he was going to do made the crowd draw breaths with thrills of joyful horror. Up and up he went, swinging himself with lissome grace, raising each trapeze with the force of his swing until he could reach the one above it. He looked smaller as he travelled higher in his wonderful flying progress. The little boys had not breath left now even to say, "Ay me, but he's grand." There was silence among all the crowd. To every one in all that crowd, to all except one, the spectacle was that of a strange man performing a strange feat. One poor peasant woman saw a different sight. One alone in all that crowd knew that the acrobat was not a stranger. In a corner of the beggars' gallery sat Betty Lamb, dirty and clothed in rags as she was. She held up her head at this hour with the old queenly defiance of her youthful days. Her eyes, bleared and sunken, had descried her son, her mother's heart, mad, though all pronounced her to be, had vibrated to the first sound of her son's voice. She knew him as certainly as if she had seen him standing before her again, this little lad of past years, or the infant cradled in the ambry of the ruined chancel. The monarchs of whom Lambetti had been glibly speaking were not more noble in rank or more surrounded with glory in the thought of Betty Lamb than was this hero of the circus, and he her son. What constitutes glory? Is it not made up of the glare of lamps and the wearing of shining clothes, the shout of 1,000 voices in applause, the glance of 1,000 eyes in admiration, and the renown that spreads into the newspapers? In the mind of Betty Lamb there was no room for gradations. She knew glory, she knew shame. She herself had sunk to shame, but now that was past. Her son had attained to glory, and her soul went out, as it were, from the circumstances of her own degradation, and accepted his glory as her own. They said, the townsfolk said, that Betty Lamb had not lacked opportunity. Ah, well, God knows better than we what to each soul may be its opportunity. Betty Lamb watched her son in his perilous upward flight, and for the first time in her life prayed that heaven would forgive her misdeeds. By some inborn instinct, she assumed that it was this prayer she must pray in order to obtain that desire of her eyes, his safety. When he reached the highest swing, when he made his leap from that awful height and caught the lower rope, there had come a change in Betty Lamb's soul. It had seemed hours, nay, years to her, the space of time in which he was swinging himself up and leaping down. Perhaps, half-witted as she had been, this was in reality her life, not the other that for 60 years she had been visibly living. She saw that his eye was fixed upon her. She knew that the kisses were thrown to her. She rose and walked erect. In her heart, a new sense of responsibility and of the value of life. Next day, in Betty Lamb's cellar room, a shadow darkened the doorway, and her son stood before her. He did not kiss her. That had not been their way. Even when he was an infant, and she had sung her songs to him in the lonely ruin, but he bowed to her with all the foreign graces that he had learned, just as if she were one of the queens before whom he had performed. She feasted her eyes upon him. He looked round upon the cellar. "You must not live here any longer," said he. For the first time in her life, humility reigned in her heart, and she resigned her gypsy freedom. "I'm thinking," she replied modestly, "that it's nae fit for the mother of such as you are noo." With the minister, Lamb Betty left money that would defray the expenses of a decent habitation for his mother, and to the wonder of all, from that day forth the mother lived in it decently. She was even charitable with her little store. She was even known to raise the fallen. When she was dead, Lamb Betty was dead too. He had lived his life fast, and, if gold be of worth, it seemed as if he had lived it to some purpose. Lamb Betty left money to the town, money for two purposes, which in due time the long-headed townsmen carried into effect. An asylum was built upon the moor. It is called Betty Lamb's Home for the Young and the Aged. The old abbey also was walled in. Lawns and flower beds were spread about the broken stones, and where the walls might totter, they were supported. The honor of this change, too, is ascribed to the famous son of Betty Lamb, who had no name but his mother's. End of section 13. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. Section 13. Section 14 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. The Soul of a Man, Chapter 1. A man was standing on one of the high roads in the south of Gloucestershire. He was a man of science. His tools and specimens were in his hand, and he was leaning against the wayside paling, enjoying a well-earned rest. A long flock of birds fluttered over the autumn fields. Beneath them, a slow ploughman trudged with his horses, breaking the yellow stubble. The sky hung low, full of sunshine, yet full of haze, an atmosphere of blue flame, and the earth was bright with the warm autumn colors of woods and hedgerow. Just as the birds were flying past, a young woman came by upon the road, treading with quick, powerful step upon the fallen leaves. She was a poor woman. Her beauty, which would have been almost perfect in a simpler gown, was marred by garments cut in cheap conformity to fashionable dress. It could not be hidden, however, and her large symmetrical figure, swinging as she walked, attracted the attention of the man as he stood there, leaning against the paling. He felt by no means disinclined to while away his hour of rest by a few soft words with the comely stranger. If he had put his thoughts into words, he would have held it as good luck that she had come to amuse his leisure, thinking very little about luck as it concerned her. His dog, lying at his feet, stirred to look at the woman, and the man, following the same instinct of nature, accosted her. "Can you tell me, my girl, what time it is?" She stopped short and looked at him. "That I can't, sir," she said in clear, hearty tones, and turned to continue her walk. "But tell me what time you think it is, my good girl. I'm not good at reading the sun." She turned again, and looking at him with a longer pause, but if there was suspicion or disapproval in her thoughts, she expressed nothing in her face. "You're a gent. I'd 'a thought you'd 'a had a watch." "But mine is at the watchmaker's getting mended," he said with a smile. He was neither young nor handsome, but he was clever, and that goes further than either in dealing with a woman. She still stood staring at him in rude independence. "The shadows is longer 'an they was a while, boy. Maybe it's 3. He sighed and shifted his position wearily against the paling, as though faint with fatigue. "You can't tell me of any place near where I can get something to eat. I have been working hard since daybreak, and now I am out of my reckoning and tired and hungry." He glanced down at his tools and earth-stained clothes. He won his wish. The woman, who would not have tarried a moment for selfish pleasure, remained out of generous pity. "I've the piece mother put up. Maybe it's big enow for we two. But I could not think of taking you luncheon," he exclaimed with a gallantry that was meant to be impressive, but was quite lost on his practical companion. She proceeded to open her parcel and examine the contents to see whether or not there was enough for 2. He also examined it critically with his eyes, in some alarm at her prompt response to his appeal. But the thick slices of bread and meat, if not dainty, were clean and of excellent quality. She took the largest and thickest bit and thrust it into his hand, very much as a mother would feed her child with the portion she considered its fair share. You may have that, for I shan't want it." "You're very kind," he said, with a touch of sarcasm, too fine for her. It appeared that, having taken out the food, she thought well to make her own meal, for she went a few steps farther on, and sitting down on the grass with her back to the paling, began to eat. A large tuft of weeds grew midway between him and her. Truly, we can foresee consequences but a very little way in our dealings with a fellow creature, and this man, as he stood munching his bread, uncertain how to proceed in winning favour from the bold beauty, was hardly pleased with the result of his encounter. His dog went and laid its head upon her knee, and she fed it with crumbs. Its master, after watching them a minute, stepped out on the road with the intention of sitting down between them and the weeds. As he did so, he caught sight, as he thought, of a man seated in the very place he intended to occupy. So strong was the impression that he started and stared. But again, as before, there was no one to be seen. The sunshine was bright upon all things. The palings were so far apart that he could see everything in the fields behind. There was no one far or near but the ploughman at half a field's distance, and they two and the dog. The woman turned coolly round and looked through the paling, as if she supposed he had seen something behind her. "Was it a hare?" she asked, eyeing him with interest. "Ye ain't feared of the like of that?" "No, it was not a hare. I did not see a hare." "What was it ye seed then?" she asked, looking at him with bold determination. "What did I see?" he repeated vaguely. "I saw nothing." "Thought ye looked as if you'd seed something," she remarked incredulously, and then went on eating and feeding the dog, as indifferent to his presence as she was to the presence of the weeds. "Are ye going far tonight?" he asked at length, thinking he would make more progress toward friendship before he sat down. "To the town." "Indeed, as far as that? Which town, may I ask?" he said with mechanical politeness, for his mind was running on what he had seen. "Ye're a fool, and no mistake," she replied with emphasis. "There's but one town within a walk." "On the contrary, I'm considered a man of great learning," he replied, with more eager self-assertion than he could hitherto have believed possible under the circumstances. "Is it larning ye got?" she asked, with much greater interest than she had before evinced. "Yes, I'm a man who spends his life seeking for knowledge." "Are ye wiser nor parson?" "Very much wiser," replied the man of science, with honest conviction. She looked much more impressed than he had hoped, and thinking that he had made himself sufficiently interesting, he began to speak about her own affairs, supposing they would please her better. "You're not a married woman," he said, looking at her ringless hand. "Married or no," she replied, "it's nowt to you." "I beg your pardon. Everything which concerns such a beautiful woman must be of interest to me." At that she laughed outright in hard derision, and went on eating her bread and meat. "But you won't tell me if you're married or not," he pleaded, pursuing a subject which he thought must interest her. He was surprised to see the sudden expression of womanly sorrow that came over her face, giving her eyes new depth and light. She answered him sadly, looking past him into the sunny distance. "No, nor like to be." I must disagree with you there. If you are not married yet, I am sure you will be very soon. I never saw a more likely lassie than yourself. Manlike, he was quite unconscious of the consummate impertinence of the form this compliment had taken, but afterwards he realized it when his idle words recurred to his mind. She turned her eyes full upon him, and said with energy, "Ye know nowt at all about it," and then added more meditatively, "Neither do parson." She had been so absorbed in her thoughts for a few minutes that she had ceased to stroke the dog, and resenting this, it raised its silky head from her lap and laid it upon her breast. Thus reminded, she smiled down into the eyes of the dog and caressed it, pressing its head closer against her bosom. The man stood a few paces away, watching these two beautiful creatures as they sat in the hazy autumn sunlight, with their background of weeds and moss-grown paling. He felt baffled and perplexed, for he knew that he stood apart, excluded from their companionship by something he could not define. So intolerable did this feeling become that he resolved to break through it, and made a hasty movement to sit down beside them. But as he stepped forward, he was suddenly aware that there was another man in the place he would have taken, embracing and protecting the girl. He swore a loud oath, and flung himself backwards to stand by the hedge on the opposite side of the road, that he might the better review the situation. It was all as it had been before, that quiet autumn landscape, only the woman appeared much interested in his sudden movements. "What was it you seed? Was it the snake?" she inquired loudly, at the same time moving her skirts to look for that dangerous reptile. "No!" he shouted, putting his whole energy into the word. "What was it you seed, cutting them capers as if ye was shot, and saying o' words neither fit for heaven above nor earth beneath?" So loudly did she ask, and so resolutely did she wait for an answer, that he was forced into speech. "I don't know," he said, with another oath milder than the first. "Well, sure now," she said, still speaking loudly, "here's something awful queer. Ye says ye're a man that's got larning more than our parson, and ye see something, and can't tell what ye seed. That's twice this short a while. Are ye often took bad the like o' that?" The bold derision of this speech fell without effect upon its object, because he perceived a gleam of mischievous intelligence in her eyes, which she had intended to conceal, but she was no adept in the art of concealment. The conviction that the woman knew perfectly what he had seen, and did not in reality despise him for his conduct, took the sting from her jeers, but did not make his position pleasanter. The repeated shock to his nerves had produced a chilly feeling of desperation and almost fear, which he could not immediately shake off, and he stood back against the opposite hedge, with his half-eaten bread in his hand, conscious that he looked and felt more like a whipped schoolboy than, as he had fondly imagined when he first stopped the woman, the hero of a rural love scene. That was nothing. He was, as he had described himself, a man who devoted his life to the search for knowledge, and personal consciousness was almost lost in the intense curiosity which the circumstances had aroused in him. With the trained mind of one accustomed to investigation, he instantly perceived that his only clue to the explanation of the phenomenon lay in the personality of the woman. His one eager desire was to probe her thought through and through. But how was he to approach the interior portals of a mind guarded by a will as free and strong as his own? He would fain have bound down her will with strong cords and analyzed the secrets of her mind with ruthless vivisection. But how? His tact, trained by all the subtleties of a life cast in cultured social relations, was unequal to the occasion, and fearing to lose ground by a false step, he remained silent. The woman finished eating and shook herself free of the crumbs. He supposed, almost with a sense of desperation, that she was about to leave him before he could begin his inquiry, but instead of moving, she motioned him to come near, and he went and stood on the road in front of her. "Ye says you're a man of learning, and I believes ye," she began. He was about to reply that he was only a seeker after truth, but he was checked by the knowledge that she would accept no answer she could not understand. He fell back on the truth as it was to her, and said simply, "Yes. I wants to ask ye 2 questions. Will you answer like an honest man?" She had laid aside all her loud rudeness, and was speaking with intense earnestness, an earnestness that won his entire respect. "I will indeed answer you honestly, if I can answer." "Then tell me this, what's the soul of a man?" He stood with lips sealed, partly by surprise at the question, and partly by self-acknowledged ignorance of the answer. "The soul of a man," she repeated more distinctly. "Ye knows what I mean, Charlie." Yes, he knew what she meant, but he knew also that his own most honest convictions hovered between a materialist philosophy and faith in the spiritual unseen. If at that moment he could have decided between the two, he would gladly have done so, for the sake of the eager woman sitting at his feet, but he knew that he did not know which was the truth. She, still laboring under the impression that she had not made her meaning plain, endeavored to explain. "Ye knows, when a man dies, there's 2 parts to him. One they buries, and one goes." She pointed upward with her thumb, not irreverently, as merely wishing to indicate a fact without the expense of words. "Yes, I understand what you mean," he said slowly. "And under that theory the soul—" "Under what?" she said sharply. "I mean that if you say the soul is divided from the body at death—" "But it is, ain't it?" she interrupted. "Yes, it is," he said, feeling that it was better to perjure himself than to shake her faith. "Go on," she said. "For Parson says the soul is the thing inside that thinks. But when a man's loony, you knows, off his head like, has he no soul then? I've looked in the catechis, and in Bible, and in prayer book, and for the life of me I don't know." "I don't wonder at that," he said with mechanical compassion, casting about in his mind for some possible motive for her extraordinary vehemence. He felt as certain, standing there, that this was a true woman, true to all the highest attributes of her nature, as if he had been able to weigh all the acts of her life and find none of them wanting. In the midst of his perplexity, he found time to ask himself whence he had this knowledge. Did he read it in the lines of her face, or was it some unseen influence of her mind upon his own? He had only time to question, not to answer, for she looked up in his face with the trust and expectation of a child awaiting his words. He spoke. "You say, when a man dies, he is divided into two parts, the body that rots and the part that lives elsewhere." He was speaking very slowly and distinctly. "If that part of a man which lives goes to heaven, where everything is quite different from this, he could have no use for most of his thoughts, what we call opinions, for they are formed on what he sees and hears and feels here. Look here." He held out his arm and moved it up and down from the elbow. "There are nerves and muscles. Behind them is something we call life. We don't know what it is. And behind your thoughts and feelings there is the same life. We don't know what it is. The part of you that you say goes to heaven must be that life. If you ask me what I think the greater part of what you call mind is part of your body. If your body can live a spirit life, so can it, but it would need as much changing first." It was most extraordinary to him to see the avidity with which she drank in his words, and also the intelligence with which she seemed to master them, for she cried, "What's it the soul, then? When ye will to do a thing again all costs, is that it the soul?" "Certainly the spirit must be the self, and the will, as far as we know, is that self. More that self than anything else is." He spoke in the pleased tone of a schoolmaster who finds that the mind beneath his touch is being moulded into the right shape, and besides, he supposed he could question her next. "I knowed that," she said with an intensity of conviction that confounded her listener. "I knowed the soul was will. It must be intelligence and will and probably memory," he said, beguiled into the idea that she was interested in the nicety of his theory, but not in any sense that activity of mind which shows itself in the opinions most men conceive so important. But of this she took no heed. "When a man's off his head or paralyzed, with no more life in him than babe unborn, yet when he's living and not dead, where's his soul then? Parson, he says the soul's sleeping inside him afore going to glory, like a grub afore it turns into a fly. But I asked him how he knowed, and he just said he knowed, and I mun believe, and that's no way to answer an honest woman." "He did not really know." "Well, tell what you knows," she said. "Indeed, I do not know anything about it." "You don't know?" "I do not know." The animation of hope slowly faded from her face, giving place to a look of bitter disappointment. It was as if a little child, suddenly denied some darling wish, should have strength to restrain its tears and mutely acquiesce in the inevitable. "Then there's nowt to say," she said, rising, sullen in the first moment of pain. "But you'll tell me why you have asked," he begged. "I am very sorry indeed that I cannot answer." "Na, I'll not tell ye, for it's no concern of yours. But thank ye kindly, sir, all the same. You're an honest man. Good day." With that she walked resolutely away, nor would she accept his offer of payment for the food she had given. He stood and watched her, feeling checkmated, until he saw her exchange greetings with the ploughman, who reached the end of his furrow as she passed the side of the field. Seeing this, he took up his specimens and walked slowly in the same direction, waiting for the ploughman's next return. As he stood at the hedge, he noticed that the labourer, who appeared to be a middle-aged man of average intelligence, surveyed him with more than ordinary interest. "Good day," he said. End of section 14. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. Section 15 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. The Soul of a Man, Chapter 2. The man of science, Skelton by name, passed some 7 days in business and pleasure at home among men of his own class, and then, impelled by an intolerable curiosity, he went to seek the home of the woman with whom he had so strange a meeting. Concerning the mad delusion from which he had suffered in her presence, his mind would give him no rest. Some further effort he must make to understand the cause of an experience which he could not reason from his memory. The effort might be futile. He could form no plan of action, yet he found himself again upon the high road which led from the nearest station to the village of West Chilton. The autumn leaf that had bedecked the trees was lying upon the ground, its brightness soiled and tarnished. The cloud rack hung above, a vault of gloom in which the upper winds coursed sadly. "This is the field," said Skelton within himself. "The ploughman has finished his work, but the crows are still flapping about it. I wonder if they are the same crows. That is the clump of weeds by which she sat. It was as red as flame then, but now it is colourless as the cinders of a fire that is gone out." His words were like straws, showing the current of his thoughts. Just then, in the west, the cloud masses in the horizon, being moved by the winds, rent asunder, exposing the land to the yellow blaze of the setting sun. The distant hills stood out against the glow in richer blue, and far and near the fields took brighter hues, warm brown of earth, ready to yield the next harvest, yellow of stubble lands at rest, bright green of slopes that fed the moving cows. There were luminous shadows, too, that gathered instantly in the copses, as if they were the forms of dryads, who could sport unseen in the murk daylight, but must fly under each shrub for refuge in the sudden sunshine. Close at his feet lay the patch of cabbages, purple cabbages they were, throwing back from each glossy leaf and stalk infinite gradations of crimson light. Parts of the leaves were not glossy, but were covered with opaque bloom of tender blue, and here and there a leaf had been broken, disclosing scarlet veins. They were still beautiful. Skelton stood looking down into the depth of their colour. It had been difficult for him to conjecture a possible cause for the phantom he had thought he saw a week before, but one theory which had floated in his mind had been that from these cabbages, which had lain a trifle too long in sun and moisture, gases might have arisen, which had disturbed his senses. It was true that his theory did not account for other instances of the same optical delusion to which the talk of the ploughman had seemed to point, but Skelton could not bring himself to attach much importance to his words. He meditated on them now as he stood. "I dare not go to the young woman and ask her to show me her shadow. If she knew I was here, she would only try to defeat my purpose. I can only interview her neighbours, and this first rustic whom I questioned shut himself up like an oyster. If all the rest act in this way, what can I do? And if I can hear all the vulgar superstition there is to be heard, will there be in the whole of it the indication of a single fact?" So he mused by the roadside, while the sun hung in the dream temple of fire made by the chasm of cloud. Then the earth moved onward into the night, and he walked on upon his curious errand. The darkness of evening had already fallen, and he was still about a mile from the village when he discerned a woman coming towards him on the road. It was the very woman about whom his mind was occupied. There was a house on one side. The gate leading to it was close to him, and not wishing to be recognized at the moment, he turned in through it to wait in the darkness of some garden shrubs till she had passed. But she did not pass. She came up, walking more and more slowly, till she stood on the road outside the gate. She looked up and down the road with a hesitating air, and then, clasping her hands behind her, leaned back against a heavy gate-post and composed herself to wait. There was light enough to see her, for there was a moon behind the clouds, and also what was left of the daylight in the west was glimmering full upon her. The house was close to the road, apparently an old farmstead, turning blank dark walls and roofs to them, so that it was evidently uninhabited, or else inhabited only at the other side. The young woman looked up at it, apparently not without distrust, but even to her keen scrutiny there was no sign of life. For the rest, the road lay through a glen, the village was out of sight, and the hills around them were like the hills in Hades, silent, shadowy, and cold. It seemed an unearthly thing that she should have come there to stand and lean against the gate, as if to shut him into his self-sought trap. And there was no impatience about this woman. She stood quite still in that dark, desolate place, as though she was perfectly contented to wait and wait. For what? How long? These were the questions he asked himself. Was this dark house the abode of evil spirits with which she was in league? And if so, what results would accrue to him? There are circumstances which suggest fantastic speculations to the most learned man. At length he heard a footfall. He could not tell where at first, but as it approached he saw a countryman in a carter's blouse coming across the opposite field. He got through the hedge and came toward the gate. Then the girl spoke in her strong voice and north country accent, but Skelton would hardly have known the voice again. It was so soft and sad. "I been waiting on ye, Johnny. Some women think shame to be first at the trysting, but that's not me when I loves ye true." At this, Skelton, by an impulse of honour, thought to pass out of earshot, and then another motive held him listening. He thought of the ghostly thing he had seen by this girl, of the wild tale the ploughman had told. The passion of investigation, which had grown lusty by long exercise, rose within him, triumphing over his personal inclinations. Too much was at stake to miss a chance like this. Honour in this situation seemed like a flimsy sentiment. He waited for the answer of the girl's lover with breathless interest. The man was evidently a fine young fellow, tall and strong, and when he spoke it was not without a touch of manly indignation in his tone. "If you love me true, Jen, I can't think what the meaning of your doings is. It's 2 years since you came to live in the glen, and you can't say if you've not understood my meaning plain since the first I saw you. It's to take you to church and take care of you as a woman ought to be took care of by a man. And you know I could do it, Jen, for my wages is good. But you've shied and shied whenever you've seen me, and balked when you couldn't shy, so as no skittish mare is half so bad." "Because, Johnny, I wouldn't have your heart broke the way mine is. I love you too true for that." "But what's to hinder that we may be like other folks is? There's troubles comes to all, but we can bear them like the rest. What's to hinder? I thought there was someone else, and that you didn't like." "God knows, Jen, if that had been the way, I'd never have troubled you again. But last night, when we heard your mother was took bad, and mother and me stepped round to see what we could do, and you let on as you did have a caring for me, I says, let's be cried in the church, so as your mother could die happy, if die she must. But when you says no, and as you'd meet me here and tell me why, I was content to wait and come here. And now what I want to know is why. What's to hinder, Jen?" "Ye knows as well as me the tales about me, Johnny." "Tales?" said the young man passionately. "What tales? All along I've knocked down any man as 'ud say a word against you." "Aye, but the women, Johnny, you couldn't knock them down. That's why a woman's tales allus the worst." "And what can they say? The worst is that if any man comes nigh you for a kiss or the like of that, and no offence, Jen, but you're an uncommonly tidy girl to kiss, he sees another man betwixt himself and you. Fools they be to believe such trash. If you'd give me the leave, which I'm not the fella to take without you say the word, I'd soon show as no shadow 'ud come betwixt." He came a step closer, reproachful in his frank respect, as if he would claim the liberty he asked, but she drew back, holding up her hand to ward him off. "I believe you half believe the nonsense yourself, Jen." "Heaven knows, Johnny, I've reason to believe it weel. None knows better nor me. It's that I've come to tell you to-night, and there's nowt for it but we mun part. And if I trouble your peace staying here in the glen, I'll go away out of your sight. It wasn't a wish o' mine to bring you trouble. None knows better nor me how hard trouble's to bear." Her voice trembled as if with some physical pain. He only answered by a sound of incredulous surprise. "I'll tell you the whole on't, Johnny. You sees, we lived in Yarm, mother and me. Mother, she sewed books for a book-binding man, and we'd a little coming in as father had saved. Well, mother, she was feared less I'd falling to rough ways like, and she kept me in a good bit, and there was a man as helped in the book-binding." She stopped, and then said half under her breath, "His name was Dougall McGare it was." "Go on, Jen." "He was a lean man and white to look at. He was very pious and knowed lots of things. Least, I don't know if he was pious, for he didn't go to church, but he'd his own thoughts of things, and he was steady
and kept himself to himself. He never telled me his thoughts of things. He said it unsettled me like. But he taught me reading, and mother, she liked his coming constant to see us. As far as I knows, he was a good man, but I tell you, Johnny, that man had a will. Whatsoever anything Dan'l McGair wanted, that thing he mun have, if he died in the getting. He was about 40, and I was nigh on 20. It was after he'd taught me reading, and whenever I'd go out here or there, or do this or that he didn't like, he'd turn white as snow, and tremble like a tree stem in the wind, and dare me to do anything as he didn't like. You see, he allus had that power over mother to make her think like him. But I wouldn't give in to him. If I'd gived in, well, I don't know what he'd a comed. God knows what did come were bad enow. She stopped speaking, and toed the damp ground, crushing her boot into the frosty mud, and drawing it backwards and forwards as she stood against the gate. Go on, Jen. Ye sees, what he will to get, that he mun have, and at the end he will to have me, mind, body, and soul. He'd a had me, only I made a stand for my life. Mother, she was all on his side, only she didn't want for me to do what I wouldn't, but she cried like, and talked to his goodness, and Dan'l, he wouldn't ask an out, or I could have told him my mind, and a done with it, but he went on giving us and paying things, and mother, she took it all, till I was fairly mad with the shame and anger on it. I don't say as I acted as I thought. I know it I'd a power over him to drive him wild like with a smile or a soft word, and power's awful dangerous for a young thing. It's like as if God gave the wind a will of its own, and didn't hold it in his own hands. Then I feared a Dan'l's power over mother, and gave in times when I ought to ha' held my own, and I liked to have him for a servant to me, and I led him on like. So it went on. He never doubted I'd marry with him, and I held out for my life. And at the end, some words we had made things worse. 'Twas in spring, in March, I think. He walked out miles and miles on the bad roads to bring me the first flowers. I was bookbinding then, out late at night, and I comed home to find he had left them for me. Snowdrops they was, and moss with a glint of green light on it, like sun shining through the trees, and there was a grey pigeon's feather he'd picked up somewheres, all clean and unruffed, like a bit of the sky at the dawn, and there was a twig with a wee pink toadstool on it, all pink and red. The sight of them fairly made me mad. 'Twas bad enow to buy me with money all the things money can buy, but it seemed he'd take the very thoughts of God Almighty and use them to get his will. I were mad, but if he had come to our house, I couldn't have spoke for mother's being there, so I just took them bits of spring in my hand, and went out in the dark to his house, and went into his room, and threw him on the floor, and stamped him with my foot, and I told him he'd sneak round to bind me to him, and as how I'd die first. I was mad, and talked till I couldn't speak, for my voice give out, and that wasn't soon. He just sat still hearing me, but he was white and shook like a man with the palsy. They said he'd had fits once, and that made him nervous, but I didn't think of him like that. He was strong, for he could make most all men do as he wanted. He was spoiling my life with his strength, and I didn't think of him as weakly. When I'd raged at him and couldn't say more, I went out and was going home in the dark, howling by the wall, as weak as a baby. and just before I got home I seed him stand just in front of me. I thought he'd run after me. Maybe he did. But I thought since, maybe not, that his body mayn't have been there at all. But anyway, I seed him stand just afore me, with his eyes large and like fire, and him all white and trembling. He said, I tell ye, Jen, I will have ye mine, and as long as I live, no other man shall. And with that, I went past him into the house. Go on, Jen, said the carter. All I knows is that the word he spoke was a true word. Next day, they comed and telled us he was found all paralysed in his chair, and he couldn't move nor speak. From that time, the doctors had sometimes come from a long way off. They said as there was something strange about his sickness. I don't know what they said. I never seed him again. There's part of him lies in the bed, and the parish feeds him, and the doctors, they talk about him. I never seed him again since that night, but I knows what he said was true, and there's many a man as had seed him near me sin that day. I tell you, Johnny, there's trouble to face in this world worse nor death. Not worse nor our own death, for that's most times a good thing, but worse near the death of them we love most true, and worse nor parting in this world, Johnny, and worse almost than sin itself. But thank God, not quite worse nor sin. But I never knowed, lad, how bad my own trouble was, though it's almost drove me hard at times. Not recking much what I said or did, I never knowed, my lad, how bad it was till I knowed it was your trouble too. The young carter stood quite silent. His blue blouse glimmered white in the darkness and flapped a little in the wind, but he stood still as a rock, with his strong arms crossed upon his breast, and the silence seemed filled with the expression of thoughts for which words would have been useless. It was evident that her strong emotion had brought to his mind a conviction of the truth of her words which could not have been conveyed by the words alone. So they stood there, he and she, in all the rugged power of physical strength, confronted with their life's problem. At last, after they had been silent a long time, and it seemed that he had said many things and that she had answered him, he appeared suddenly to sum up his thoughts to their conclusion, and stretched out both his strong arms to take her and all her griefs into his heart. It seemed in the darkness as though he did clasp her, and did not, for she gave a low, terrible cry, and fled from him, a cry such as a spirit might give, who, having ascended to heaven's gate with toil and prayer, falls backward into hell. And she ran from him. It seemed that with only her human strength she could not have fled so fast. He followed her, dashing with all his strength into the darkness. They went towards the village, and in the mud their footfalls were almost silent. The listener came out of his hiding and went back on the road by which he had come. End of section 15. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California.
Section 16 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. The Soul of a Man, Chapter 3.
Next morning, Skelton travelled northward to Yarm, After some difficulty, he succeeded in discovering the paralytic whom he sought. The medical interest, which had at first been aroused by the case, appeared to have died away, and it was only after some time spent in interviewing officials that he found the man, Daniel McGare. A parish apothecary had him in charge. The apothecary was a coarse, good-natured fellow, one of that class of ignorant men upon whose brains the dregs of a refined agnosticism have settled down in the form of arrogant assumption. He had enough knowledge of the external matters of science to know, upon receiving Skelton's card, that he was receiving a visitor of distinction. "Yes, sir," he said, leading the way out of the dispensary. "I'll exhibit the case. I don't know that there's much that's remarkable about it. Of course, to us who take an interest in science, all these things are interested in their way." It was quite clear he did not know in what way the most special interest accrued to this case. "No, sir, he ain't in the Union. He's saved, and bought his cottage before his stroke. So that's where he is. He ain't got no kith or kin as far as we know." It was bright noonday when they walked through the narrow streets of mean houses, passing among the numerous children which swarm in such localities. The sun was shining, the children were shouting, the women were gossiping at their doors, when the apothecary stopped at a low one-room cottage, the home of Daniel McGare. He opened the door with a key and went in, as though the house were empty. It was a plain, bare room. There was no curtain on the window, and the sun shone in. There was a smouldering fire in the grate, a bookshelf on one side, still holding its dusty and unused volumes. There was an armchair. Was that the chair in which he had sat to see his love gifts trampled down, in which he had received that mysterious stroke from the unseen enemy? There was also a table in the room, and a chest, and in the corner a pallet bed, upon which lay the withered body of a man. That was all, except some prints that hung upon the wall, dusty and lifeless looking. Such changes do years of disuse make in dwellings, which when inhabited have been replete with human interest. Even yet there was abundant indication that the room had once been the abode of one who put much of his own personality into his surroundings. The chair and the chest were carved with a rude device, the devil grappling with the Son of God. The prints were crude, allegorical representations of life and death. The books were full of the violent polemic of the Reformation. A flower pot stood on the window sill. Perhaps 10 years ago it had had a flower in it, but now it held the apothecary's empty phials. Everything proclaimed the room tenantless. Skelton walked to the bed and looked down upon it with profound curiosity. Only the head lay above the coverlet, withered and shrunken as it was, yet the brow was high, and it was plain that the features had been fine and strong, betokening the once keen and sensitive nerve. There was nothing sensitive now. All thought and feeling had forever fled. The half-shut lids disclosed the vacant eyes. The hair lay clammy and matted on the wrinkled brow. There was nothing of life left but the breath. "It's my opinion, sir, that he'll live out his natural time. It's a theory of mine that we are all born with a certain length of life in us, and barring accident, that time will live. Well, of course, this man had the accident of his stroke, which by rights ought to have done for him. But by some fluke he weathered it, and now he'll live out his time. If one could find out his ancestors and see how long they each lived, with little calculation I could tell you how long he'd lie there." With that, the apothecary poked his patient in the cheek and jerked him by the arm to show Skelton how completely consciousness was gone. He would have treated a corpse with more respect. The lowest of us has some reverence for death. Just then, the door, which had been left ajar, was pushed open, and a slight, sweet-faced woman came in from the street. She was evidently a district Bible reader, but although perceiving that she had entered a house where she was not needed, she advanced as far as the bed, and looked down upon it with a passion of tenderness and pity depicted on her face. "Bless you, Mum, he ain't suffering," said the apothecary. "I was thinking of his soul, not of his body," she said. "I was wondering if he had been prepared to meet his Creator." "Where do you suppose his soul is?" asked Skelton curiously. He asked the question in all reverence. She was not a lady apparently, only a working woman, but there was about her the strong majesty of a noble life. "He is not dead yet," she replied with evident astonishment. "Lor, Mum," said the apothecary, "his brain ain't in working order just at present, and as for his spirit apart from his body, that's an unknown quantity we scientific men don't deal in." She looked at them both with a look of indescribable compassion and went away. Skelton would have followed the woman out into the sunny street, but he remained to pay that courtesy which was due to the brusque good nature of his companion. After examining the room and finding nothing more of interest, he went and talked over the physical circumstances of the case with the parish doctor. He did not gain much information about the patient's diseased body, and naturally none whatever concerning the whereabouts of his soul. The peculiar interest of the case he did not mention to anyone. Afterwards he went back to the neighbourhood by himself and endeavoured, as quietly as possible, to find out what traces the man's past life had left upon the minds of his neighbours. 10 years bring more change to any community than we are apt to suppose, and among the poor, where rude necessity rules rather than choice, there is more change than among the rich. There were a few who had seen McGare moving up and down the streets, and knew him to be a bookbinder by trade. One or two remembered the widow Wilkes and her daughter, and could affirm that they had been friends of McGare, and had moved away after his illness. Whither they had gone, no one knew. When there was nothing more to be seen or heard at Yarm, Skelton went home. Again he threw himself into all the daily interests of his life, in order that he might think the more dispassionately of the circumstances of this strange case. In truth, it was not now entirely out of curiosity that he was tempted to think of it. His sympathy had been stirred by the courage and sorrow of the woman whom he had so idly accosted on that bright autumn day only a few weeks before. She had appealed to him because he had knowledge. Was all his knowledge, then, powerless to help her? He believed that the shadowy appearance which dogged her footsteps could only be some projection of mind. Whether or not its cause was the strong will of the paralytic transcending the ordinary limits of time and space, he could not tell. Certainly no discussion as to its nature and origin could in any way aid its victim, and he could only fall back upon the comfort material kindness and sympathy could give. At last he went down once more to West Chilton, this time for the express purpose of seeing Jen. He found the cottage in the Glen Road near the village, and his knock was answered by Jen herself. She recognized him instantly, but was too preoccupied to take much interest in the fact of his coming. He learned that her mother had just died, and that the neighbours were in the house, keeping vigil during the few sad days preceding the burial. It was evident that there was little real sympathy between them and the bereaved daughter, so he easily persuaded her to come out and walk a bit up the road with him. She did so, evidently supposing that he had some business with her, but too deeply buried in her sorrow to inquire what it was. They came to the house by the roadside where he had last seen her, and she had been unconscious of his presence. The place seemed to rouse her from the dullness of grief, and she suddenly raised her head, like a beautiful animal scenting some cause of excitement, and stood still, looking round with brightened eyes, taking long deep breaths in the pure frosty air. No doubt she had passed the same road many times since the tryst, but the mind, which has lately stood face to face with death, perceives more clearly the true relations of all things to itself, and in this spot, among all life shiftings of the things that seem and are not, she had stood and wrestled with the reality of her ghostly bondage. All about them the hills were covered with the year's first snow. How bright the light was upon their heights! How soft the shadows that gathered in their slopes! The fields were white also, and the hedgerows. Above them the sky was veiled with snow clouds, soft and grey, except that at the verge of east and west there were faint metallic lines, such as one sees upon clouds across snowfields, like the pale reflection of a distant fire. Jen had come to a full stop now. She raised her hands to her face and sobbed out like a little child. Skelton stood by her, feeling his own feebleness. "I know you're in great trouble," he said. Her sobs did not last long. She soon mastered them, not by any act of concealment, but by rude force. Then, standing shamefaced, with half-averted head, she wiped her eyes with her apron. "Yes, sir, I'm in great trouble, greater ye can know, for death's neither here nor there. It's living that's hard. Parson, he speaks out about preparing to die, but to my mind it takes a sight more preparing to know how to go on living." "I know that you have greater trouble than your mother's death. I know that you love a young man who loves you, and also what it is that you think keeps you apart from him." "And how do you know that, sir?" she asked, still with averted face. Then he confessed humbly enough just how he did know it, and all that he knew, and told her about his visit to Yarm. When he spoke of Yarm and his visit to Daniel McGair, she turned and looked full at him, drinking in every word with hungry curiosity. "Yes, sir, we left the place, and I haven't heard of him this 9 year, but I knowed he wasn't dead." "How did you know that, Jen?" "Because, sir, when God Almighty sees fit that he should die, I'll be free of him, that's all." "And aren't you going to marry?" "No, sir. Johnny and me has talked it over, and he says as how he'll wait till such time as I'm free. And I didn't say now to him, for when one knows what it is to love true, sir, one knows well it's no use to say as this thing's best or t'other, but just it's like being taken up like a leaf by the wind and moved whether one will or no. There's just this difference betwixt true love and the common kind. The common kind of love moves ye in the wrong way, and true love in the right, for it's a true word that blessed St. John said when he said that love is God." "Did St. John say that?" said Skelton. "Yes, sir. I read it to mother just afore she died, and Johnny's gone across the sea, sir, wi' his mother. He got a right good chance to better hisself, and I made him go. His ship sailed the day after Christmas, and I said, 'Johnny, I'll bide here,' and God'll take care o' me as well as ye could yourself. And I said, Johnny, I'll pray every day, night and morning, that if ye can forget me, ye will. For if ye can forget, then your love's not o' the right sort as I could take, or God 'ud want ye to give. And if ye can forget, then there's nowt to say, but as I'll bide here. And I say, sir, as he munna think as loving him make me sad, for I was a big sight happier to love him, and if he forgets, or if he comes again. Will you live here, Jen, where the neighbours distrust you? It 'ud just be the same any place, sir, and here I can work in the fields spring and harvest, and earn my own bread. I know the fields, sir, and the hills. They're like friends to me now, and I knows the dumb things about, and they all knows me. It's a sight o' help one can get, sir, when one's down with the sorrow o' all the world lying on the heart, to have a kind look and a word with the dogs and cows when they come down from the hills for the milking. And the children, they mostly lets come to me now, though they kep 'em from me at first. Then he told her that he had come a long way on purpose to see if he could help her, that he felt ashamed of having listened to her story, and that it would give him happiness in some way or other to make her life more easy. He explained that he had a great deal of money and many friends, and could easily give her anything that these could procure. In saying this, he did not disguise from himself for a moment that his motive was mixed, and that he desired to gain some hold over her such as benevolence could give, that he might further examine the problem of her extraordinary misfortune. Even as he spoke, he marvelled at the strength of his respect for her, which could so outweigh his own interest as to make it impossible that he should interfere in her affairs otherwise than with all deference, as if she were a lady. When he had made it quite clear to her that he was able and willing to give her anything she should ask, she thought of his words a while, and then answered, I thank ye, sir, but there's nowt ye can do o' that sort, for if there were, I'd take it from Johnny and none other. But there's one thing I'll ask, sir, and with all your kind offers ye can't but agree to it, for it's not much. Ye've found out this tale o' my life. There's none else as knows it, save mother lying dead, and Johnny I telled for love's sakes, and him as lied palsied in Yarm. God Almighty only knows, sir, what Daniel McGare could tell on, but this I ask, sir, that ye'll keep all ye knows, and say nowt. I did Daniel a great wrong, for I smiled on him whilst for the sake of power, not but what he did me a worse wrong, so far worse, that whiles I think no woman has so sore a life as me. But I did him wrong, sir, and for that reason I'll not ha' his name blazed abroad, hanging on to a tale as had buzzed in the ears o' all. To tell it 'ud not make my life worse, but better, for now them as sees this thing says dark things, and speaks o' the devil and worse. The times have been when I cursed God and prayed to die, but thank heaven, when I learned what love was, I learned as God Almighty can love us in spite of our wrongdoing and the pain it brings. The use of such sore pain as mine, sir, isna for us to say, or to think great things to bear it patient, but the use of life, sir, to my thinking, is to keep all his creatures from pain if we can, and to take God's love like the sunshine and be thankful. So I'll ask ye to keep what ye knows of this tale, and not speak on it, and go no more to Yarm, and if you'll give me your hand on that, sir, I'll thank you kindly. So he gave her his hand on it, and went away. End of section 16. Recording by James McAndrew, San Francisco, California.
Section 17 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 1. The earth was white, the firmament was white, the plumage of the wind was white. The wind flew between curling drift and falling cloud, brushing all comers with its feathers of light, dry snow. At the sides of the road the posts and bars of log fences stood above the drifts. On the side of the hill the naked maple trees formed a soft bush of grey, just in sight and no more. The white tin roof and grey walls of a huge church in a small village were visible. All else was unbroken snow. The surface of an ice-covered lake, the sloping fields, the long straight road between the fences were as pure, in their far-reaching whiteness, as the upper levels of some cloud in shadeless air. A young Englishman was travelling alone through this region. He had set out from the village and was about to cross the lake. A shaggy pony, a small sleigh, a couple of buffalo robes, and a portmanteau formed his whole equipment. The snow was light and dry. The pony trotted, although the road was soft. The young man, wrapped in his fur-lined coat, had little to do in driving. In England, no one would set out in such a storm, but this traveller had learned that in Canada the snowy vast is regarded as a plaything, or a good medium of transit, or at the worst, an encumbrance to be plodded through as one plods through the storms of rain. He had found that he was not expected to remain at inn merely because it snowed, and, being a man of spirit, he had on this day, as on others, done what was expected of him. To-day, in the snow and wind, there was a slight difference from the storms of other days. The innkeeper, who had given him his horse an hour before by the walls of the great tin-roofed church, had looked at the sky and the snow, and asked if he knew the road well, but this had been accepted as an ignorant distrust of the foreign gentleman. Having learned his lesson, that through falling snow he must travel, into the heart of this greater snowstorm he travelled, valiant, if somewhat doubtful. When he descended upon the ice of the lake, he was no longer accompanied by the grey length of log fences. This road across the lake had been well tracked after the former snowfalls, and so the untrodden snow rose high on either sides. Branches of fir and cedar, stuck at short intervals at these snow walls, marked out the way. The pony ceased to trot. The driver was only astonished that this cessation of speed had not come sooner. Standing up in his sleigh and looking round, he could see 2 or 3 other sleighs travelling across near the village. The village he could no longer see, scarcely even the hill, nor was there any communication over the deep untrodden snow between his road and that other on which there were travellers. Another hour passed, and now, as he went on slowly up the length of the lake, all sound and sight of other sleighs were lost. The cloud was not dark. The snow fell in such small flakes that it did not seem that even an infinite number of them could bury the world. The wind drifting them together, though strong, was not boisterous. The March evening did not soon darken, and yet there was something in the determined action of cloud and wind and snow, making the certainty that night would come with no abatement, which caused even the inexperienced Englishman to perceive that he was passing into the midst of a heavy storm. As is frequently the case with travellers, he had certain directions concerning the road which appeared to be adequate, until he was actually confronted with that small portion of the earth's surface to which it was necessary to apply them. He was to take the first road which crossed his, running from side to side of the lake, but the first cross-track appeared to him so narrow and so deeply drifted that he did not believe it to be the public road he sought. Some farm, hidden in the level maple bush just seen through the falling snow, sends an occasional cart to the village by this by-path. So he reassured himself, and the pony, who had spied the track first and paused to have time to consider it, at the word of command obediently plodded its continuous route. A quarter of a mile farther on, the traveller saw something in the road in front. As the sound of his pony's jangling bells approached, a horse lifted its head and shook its own bells. The horse, the sleigh which it ought to have been drawing, were standing still, full in the centre of the road. The first thought, that it was cheering to come up on the trace of another wayfarer, was checked by the gloomy idea that some impassable drift must bar the way. The other sleigh was a rough wooden platform on runners. Upon it a man, wrapped in a ragged buffalo skin, lay prostrate. The Englishman jumped to the ground and waited till he could lay his hand upon the recumbent figure. At a touch the man jumped fiercely, and shook himself from sleep. Warm, luxurious sleep, only that, seemed to have enthralled him. His cheeks were red, his aquiline nose, red also, suggested some amount of strong drink, but his black eyes were bright, showing that the senses were wholly alive. He looked defiant, inquiring. He was a French Canadian, apparently a habitant, but he understood the English questions addressed to him. The curious thing was that he seemed to have no reason for stopping. When he had with difficulty made way for the gentleman to pass him on the road, he followed slowly, as it seemed reluctantly. A mile farther on the Englishman, now far in front, suspected that the other had again stopped, and wondered much. The man's face had impressed him. His high cheekbones, the aquiline nose, the clearness of the eye and complexion, these had not expressed dull folly. Now the Englishman came to another cross-road, wider but more deeply drifted than the track he was on. He turned into it and ploughed the drifts. When he reached the shore, where the land undulated, the drifts were still deeper. There were no trees here. He could see no house. There was hardly any evidence, except the evergreen branches stuck in the sides, that the road had ever been trodden. The March dusk had now fallen, yet not darkly. The full moon was beyond the clouds, and whatever wave of light came from declining day or rising night was held in by, and reflected slothfully from, the storm of pearl. After some debate he turned back to the lake in his former road. It must lead somewhere. He pressed steadily on toward the western end of the lake. The western shore was level. He hardly knew when he was upon the land. The glimmering night blinded the traveller. No ray of candlelight was in sight. He began to think that he was destined to see his horse slowly buried and himself to fight, as long as might be, a losing battle with the fiends of the air. At last the plodding pony stopped again resolutely. Long lines of Lombardy poplars here met the road. They were but as the ghosts of trees. Their stately shape, their regular succession, inspired him with some sentiment of romance which he did not stay to define. He dimly discerned shrubs, as if planted in a pleasure ground. Wading and fumbling he found a paling and a gate. The pony turned off the high road with renewed courage in its motion. The Englishman, letting loose the rein, found himself drawn slowly up a long avenue of ghostly poplar trees. The road was straight, the land was flat, the poplars were upright. The simplicity affected him with the notion that he was coming to an enchanted palace. The pony approached the door of a large house, dim to the sight. Its huge pointed tin roof, its stone sides, mantled as they were with snowflakes and fringed with icicles at eaves and lintels, hardly gave a dark outline in the glimmering storm. The rays of light which twinkled through chinks of shutters might be analogous to the stars produced by a stunned brain. It seemed to the Englishman that if he went up and tried to knock on the door, the ghostly house, the ghostly poplar avenue, would vanish. The thought was born of the long monotony of a danger which had called for no activity of brain or muscle on his part. The pony knew better. It stopped before the door. The traveller stood in a small porch raised a step or two from the ground. The door was opened by a middle-aged Frenchwoman clad in a peasant's gown of bluish grey. Behind her, holding a lamp a little above her head, stood a young girl, large, womanly in form, with dimpled softness of face, and dressed in a rich but quaint garment of amber colour. With raised and statuesque wrist, she held the lamp aloft to keep the light from dazzling her eyes. She was looking through the doorway with the quiet interest of responsibility, nothing of which was expressed in the servant's furrowed countenance. "Is the master of the house at home?" "There is no master." The girl spoke with a mellow voice and with a manner of soft dignity, yet, having regarded the stranger, there leaped into her face, as it seemed to him, behind the outward calm of the dark eyes and dimpling curves, a certain excited interest and delight. The current of thought thus revealed contrasted with the calm which she instinctively turned to him, as the words which an actor speaks aside contrast with those which are not soliloquy. With more hesitation, more obvious modesty, he said, "May I speak to the mistress of the house?" "I am the mistress." He could not but look upon her more intently. She could not have been more than 18 years of age. Her hair had the soft and loose manner of lying upon her head that is often seen in hair which has, till lately, been allowed to hang loose to the winds. Her dress, folded over the bosom and sweeping to the ground in ample curves, was, little as he could have described a modern fashion, even to his eyes evidently fantastic, such as a child might don at play. Above all, as evidence of her youth, there was that inward quiver of delight at his appearance and presence, veiled perfectly, but seen behind the veil, as one may detect glee rising in the heart of a child, even though it be upon its formal behaviour. "Can you tell me if there is any house within reach where I can stop for the night?" He gave a succinct account of his journey, the lost road, the increasing storm. "My horse is dead tired, but it might go a mile or so farther." The serving woman, evincing some little curiosity, received from the girl an interpretation in low, rapid French. The woman expressed by her gestures some pity for man and beast. The girl replied with gentle brevity, "We know that the roads are snowed up. The next house is 3 miles farther on." He hesitated, but his necessity was obvious. "I am afraid I must beg for a night's shelter." He had been wondering a good deal what she would say, how she would accede, and then he perceived that her dignity knew no circumlocution. "I will send the man for your horse." She said it with hardly a moment's pause. The woman gave him a small broom, an implement to the use of which he had grown accustomed, and disappeared upon the errand. The girl stood in her statuesque pose of light-bearer. The young man busied himself in brushing the snow from cap, coats, and boots. As he brushed himself he felt elation in the knowledge, not ordinarily uppermost, that he was a good-looking fellow and a gentleman. End of chapter 1. Section 18 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 2. "My name is Courthope." The visitor, denuded of coat and cap, presented his card, upon which was written Mr. George Courthope. He began telling his hostess whence he came and what was his business. A quarry which a dead relative had bequeathed to him had had sufficient attraction to bring him across the sea and across this railless region. His few words of self-introduction were mingled with and followed by regrets for his intrusion, expressions of excessive gratitude. All the time his mind was questioning amazedly. By the time the speeches which he deemed necessary were finished, he had followed the girl into a spacious room, furnished in the large gay style of the 50s, brightly lit, as if for a festival, and warmed by a log fire of generous dimensions. Having led him in, listening silently the while, and put her additional lamp upon the table, she now spoke, with no empressement, almost with a matter of insouciance. "You are perfectly welcome. My father would never have wished his house to be inhospitable." With her words his own apologies seemed to lose their significance. He felt a little foolish, and she, with some slight evidence of childish awkwardness, seemed to seek a pretext for short escape. "I will tell my sister." These words came with more abruptness, as if the interior excitement was working itself to the surface. The room was a long one. She went out by a door at the farther end, and, as with intense curiosity he watched her quickly receding form, he noticed that when she thought herself out of his sight, she entered the other room with a skip. At the same end of the room hung a full-length portrait of a gentleman. It was natural that Courthope should walk towards it, trying to become acquainted with some link in the train of circumstances which had raised this enchanted palace in the wilderness. He had not followed to hear, but he overheard. Liz, it's a real young man." "No, you are only making up, and," here a touch of querulousness, "I've often told you that I don't like make-ups that one wants too much to be true. I'll only have the Austens and Sir Charles and Evelina and—" "Liz, he's not a make-up. The fairies have sent him to our party. Isn't it just fairly entrancing? He has a curly moustache and a nice nose. He's English, like father. He says can't and shan't and hey and they'a. Genuine, no affectation. Oh," here came a little gurgle of joy, "and tonight, too. It's the first perfectly joyful thing that has ever come to us." Courthope moved quietly back and stood before the blazing logs, looking down into them with a smile of pure pleasure upon his lips. It was not long before the door, which she had left ajar, was reopened, and a light wheeled chair was pushed into the room. It contained a slight, elfin-like girl, white-faced, flaxen-haired, sharp-featured, and arrayed in gorgeous crimson. The elder sister pushed from behind. The little procession wore an air of triumphant satisfaction, still tempered by the proprieties. "This is my sister," said the mistress of the house. "I am very glad to see you, Mr. Courthope." The tones of Eliz were sharp and thin. She was evidently acting a part, as with the air of a very grand lady she held out her hand. He was somewhat dazzled. He felt it not inappropriate to ask if he had entered fairyland. Eliz would have answered him with a fantastic affirmative, but the elder sister, like a sensible child who knew better how to arrange the game, interposed. "I'll explain it to you. Eliz and I are giving a party tonight. There hasn't been any company in the house since father died 4 years ago, and we know he wouldn't like us to be dull, so when our stepmother went out and sent word that she couldn't come back tonight, we decided to have a grand party. There are only to be play people, you know. All of the people in Miss Austen's books are coming, and the nice ones out of Sir Charles Grandison." She paused to see if he understood. "Are the Mysteries of Udolpho invited?" he asked. "No, the others we chose here and there, because we liked them. Evelina, although she was rather silly, and we told her that we couldn't have Lord Ormford, and Miss Matty, and Brother Peter out of Cranford, and Moses Wakefield, because we liked him best of the family, and the Portuguese nun who wrote the letters. We thought we would have liked to invite the young man in Maud to meet her, but we decided that we should have to draw the line somewhere and leave out the poetry people." The girl, leaning her forearm slightly on the back of her sister's chair, gave the explanation in soft, business-like tones, and there was only the faintest lurking of a smile about the corners of her lips to indicate that she kept in view both reality and fantasy. "I think that I shall have to ask for an introduction to the Portuguese nun," said Courthope. "The others, I am happy to say, I've met before." A smile of approval leapt straight out of her dark eyes into his, as if she would have said, "Good boy, you have read quite the right sort of books." Eliz was not endowed with the same well-balanced sense of proportion. For the time the imaginary was the real. "The only question that remains to be decided," she cried, "is what you would prefer to be. We will let you choose. Bingley, or Darcy, or—" "It would be fair to tell him," said the other, her smile broadening now, "that it's only the elderly people and notables who have been invited to dinner. The young folks are coming in after. So if you are hungry—" Her soft voice paused, as if suspended in mid-air, allowing him to draw the inference. "It depends entirely on who you are, who I would like to be." He did not realize that there was undue gallantry in his speech. He felt exactly like another child playing, loyally determined to be her mate, whatever the character that might entail. "I will even be the idiotic Edward, if you are Eleanor Dashwood." Her chin was raised just half an inch higher. The smile that had been peeping from eyes and dimples seemed to retire for the moment. "Oh, we," she said, "are the hostesses. My sister is Eliz King, and I am Madge King. And I think you had better be a real person too, just a Mr. Courthope, come in by accident." "Well, then, He can help us in the receiving and chatting to them. Eliz was quite reconciled. He felt glad to realize that his mistake had been merely playful. In that case, may I have dinner without growing grey? He asked it of Madge, and her smile came back, so readily that she forgot what she had hardly consciously perceived. When the sharp-voiced little Eliz had been wheeled into the dining-room to superintend some preparations there before the meal was ready, Courthope could again break through the spell that the imaginary reception imposed. He came from his dressing-room to find Madge at the housewifely act of replenishing the fire. Filled with curiosity, unwilling to ask questions, he remarked that he feared she must often feel lonely, that he supposed Mrs. King did not often make visits unaccompanied by her daughters. "She does not, worse luck," Madge on her knees replied with childish audacity. "I hope when she returns she may not be offended by my intrusion." "Don't hope it," she smiled. "Such hope would be in vain." He could not help laughing. "Is it dutiful of you," he paused, "or of me?" "Which do you prefer, to sleep in the barn, or that I should be undutiful and disobey my stepmother?" In a minute she gave her chin that lift in the air that he had seen before. "You need not feel uncomfortable about Mrs. King. The house is really mine, not hers, and father always had his house full of company. I am doing my duty to him in taking you in, and in making a feast to please Eliz when the stepmother happens to be away, and I can do it peaceably. And when she happens to be here, I do my duty to him by keeping the peace with her." "Is she unkind to you?" he asked, with the ready, overflowing pity that young men are apt to give to pretty women who complain. But she would have him know that she had not complained. There was no bitterness in her tone. Her philosophy of life was all sweetness. "No, bless her! God made her, I suppose, just as he made us. So, according to the way she is made, she packs away all the linen and silver, she keeps this room shut up for fear it will get worn out, and we never see any visitors. But to-day she went away to St. Philippi to see a dying man. I think she was going to convert him or something, but he took a long time to die, and now we may be snowed up for days, and we are going to have a perfectly glorious time." She added hospitably, "You need not feel under the slightest obligation, for it gives us pleasure to have you, and I know that father would have taken you in." Courthope rose up and followed her glance, almost an adoring glance, to the portrait he had before observed. He went and stood again face to face with it. A goodly man was painted there, dressed in a judge's robe. Courthope read the lineaments by the help of the living interpretation of the daughter's likeness. Benevolence in the mouth, a love of good cheer and good friends in the rounded cheeks, a lurking sense of the poetry of life in the eyes, and in the brow reason and a keen sense of right proportion dominant. He would have given something to have exchanged a quiet word with the man in the portrait, whose hospitality, living after him, he was now receiving. Madge had been arranging the logs to her satisfaction. She would not accept Courthope's aid, and now she told him who were going to dine with them. She had great zest for the play. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, of course, and we thought we might have Mr. Knightley, because he is a squire and not so very young, even though he is not yet married. Miss Bates, of course, and the Westons. Miss Dashwood has declined, of which we are rather glad, but we are having Mrs. Jennings." She went on with her list. "We could not help asking Sir Charles with Lord and Lady G., because he is so important, but Grandmamma Shirley is mortifying at present. She wrote that she could not stand so rich a regale. Sir Hargrave Pollexfen will come afterwards with Harriet, and I am thankful to say that Lady Clementia is not in England at present, so could not be invited." She stopped, looking up at him freshly to make a comment. "Don't you detest Lady Clementia?" When they went into the dining-room, the choice spirits deemed worthy to be at the board were each introduced by name to the Lady Eliz, who explained that because of her infirmities she had been unable to have the honour of receiving them in the drawing-room. She made appropriate remarks, inquiring after the relatives of each, offering congratulations or condolences as the case demanded. It was cleverly done. Courthope stood aside, immensely entertained, and when at last he, too, began to offer spirited remarks to the imaginary guests, he went up in favour so immensely that Eliz cried, "Let Mr. Courthope take the end of the table. Let Mr. Courthope be father. It's much nicer to have a master of the house." She began at once introducing him to the invisible guests as her father, and Madge, if she did not like the fancy, did not cross her will. There was in Madge's manner a large good-humoured tolerance. The table was long, and amply spread with fine glass and silver. Nothing was antique. Everything was in the old-fashioned tasteless style of a former generation, but the value of solid silver was not small. The homely serving-woman in her peasant-like dress stood aside, submissive, as it seemed, but ignorant of how to behave at so large a dinner. Courthope, who in a visit to the stables had discovered that this Frenchwoman with her husband and one young daughter were at present the whole retinue of servants, wondered the more that such precious articles as the young girls and the plate should be safe in so lonely a place. Madge was seated at the head of the table, Courthope at the foot. Eliz in her high chair had been wheeled to the centre of one side. Madge, playing the hostess with gentle dignity, was enjoying herself to the full, a rosy, cooing sort of joy in the play, in the feast that she had succeeded in preparing, in her amusement at the literary sallies of Eliz, and, above all perhaps, in the company of the new and unexpected playmate to whom, because of his youth, she attributed the same perfect sympathy with their sentiments which seemed to exist between themselves. Courthope felt this. He felt that he was idealized through no virtue of his own, but it was a delightful sensation, and brought out the best that was in him of wit and pure joyfulness. To Eliz the creatures of her imagination were too real for perfect pleasure. Her face was tense, her eyes shot sparkles of light, her voice was high. For her the entertainment of the invisible guests involved real responsibility and effort. "Asides are allowed, of course?" said Eliz, as if pronouncing a debatable rule at cards. "Of course," said Madge, "or we could not play." "It's the greatest fun," cried Eliz, "to hear Sir Charles telling Mr. John Knightley about the good example that a virtuous man ought to set. With hands and eyes uplifted, he is explaining the duty he owes to his Maker. It's rare to see John Knightley's face. I seated them on purpose with only Miss Matty between them, because I knew she wouldn't interrupt." Courthope saw the smile in Madge's eyes was bent upon him as she said softly, "You won't forget that you have Lady Catherine de Bourgh at your right hand to look after. I can see that Brother Peter has got his eye upon her, and I don't know how she would take the seraphim story." "If she begins any of her dignified impertinence here," he answered, "I intend to steer her into a conversation with Charlotte, Lady G." Courthope had a turkey to carve. He was fain to turn from the guest to ask advice as to its anatomy of Madge, who was carving a ham, and assured Mr. Woodhouse that it was thrice baked, exactly as Searle would have done it. "Stupid! It was apples that were baked," whispered Eliz. "You see," said Madge, when she had told him how to begin upon the turkey, "we wondered very much what a dinner of 2 full courses might be, and where the corner dishes were to be set. We did not quite know. Do you?" "You must not have asides that are not about the people," cried Eliz intensely. "Catherine Morland's mother is talking common sense to General Tilney and Sir Walter Elliot, and there'll be no end of a row in a minute if you don't divert their attention." Eliz had more than once to call the other two to account for talking privately adown the long table. "What a magnificent ham!" he exclaimed. "Do you keep pigs?" Madge had a frank way of giving family details. "It was once a dear little pig, and we wanted to teach it to take exercise by running after us when we went out, but the stepmother, like Bunyan, penned it, until at last it came to be, for length and breadth, the bigness which you see." More than once he saw Madge's quick wit twinkle through her book lore. When he was looking ruefully at a turkey by no means neatly carved, she gave the comforting suggestion, "'Tis impious in a good man to be sad." "I thought it one of the evidences of piety." "It is true that he was young who said it, but so are we. Let us believe it fervently." When Madge swept across the drawing-room, with her amber skirts trailing, and Eliz had been wheeled in, they received the after-dinner visitors. Courthope could almost see the room filled with quaint creations to whom they were both bowing and talking incessantly. "Mr. Courthope, Miss Jane Fairfax. I believe you have met before." Madge's voice dropped in a well-feigned absorption in her next guest, but she soon found time again to whisper to him a long speech, which Miss Bates had made to Eliz. Soon afterwards she came flying to him in the utmost delight to repeat what she called a "lovely sneap" which Lady G. had given to Mrs. Elton. Nor did she forget to tell him that Emma Woodhouse was explaining to the Portuguese nun her reasons for deciding never to marry. "Out of sheer astonishment she appears to become quite tranquillized," said Madge, as if relating an important fact. His curiosity concerning this nun grew apace, for she seemed a favourite with both the girls. When it was near midnight the imaginary pageant suddenly came to an end, as in all cases of enchantment. Eliz grew tired, one of the lamps smoked and had to be extinguished, the fire had burned low. Madge declared that the company had departed. She went out of the room to call the servant, but in a few minutes she came back discomfited, a little pout on her lips. "Isn't it tiresome? Mathilde and Jacques Morin have gone to bed." "It's just like them," fretted Eliz. At the fretful voice Madge's face cleared. "What does it matter?" she cried. "We are perfectly happy." She lifted the lamp with which he had first seen her, and commenced an inspection of doors and shutters. It was a satisfaction to Courthope to see the house. It was a French building, as were all the older houses in that part of the country, heavily built, simple in the arrangements of its rooms. Every door on the lower floor stood open, inviting the heat of a large central stove. Insisting upon carrying the lamp while Madge made her survey, he was introduced to a library at the end of the drawing-room, to a large house-place or kitchen behind the dining-room. These with his own room made the square of the lower story. A wing adjoining the further side was devoted to the Morins. Having performed her duty as householder, Madge said good night. "We have enjoyed it ever so much more because you were here." She held out her hand. Her face was radiant. He knew that she spoke the simple truth. She lifted the puny Eliz in her arms and proceeded to walk slowly up the straight staircase which occupied one half of the long central hall. The crimson scarves hanging from Eliz, the length of her own silk gown, embarrassed her. She stopped a moment on the second step, resting her burden upon one lifted knee to clutch and gather the gorgeous raiment in her hand. "You see we put on mother's dresses that have always been packed away in the garret." Very simply she said this to Courthope, who stood holding a lamp to light them in their ascent. He waited until the glinting colours of their satins, the slow motion of the burden-bearer's form, reached the top and were lost in the shadow of an open door. End of chapter 2. Section 19 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid. Chapter 3. Courthope opened the shutters of his window to look out upon the night. They were heavy wooden shutters clasped with an iron clasp. A French window he could also open. Outside that a temporary double window was fixed in the casement with light hooks at the four corners. The wind was still blustering around the lonely house, and, after examining the twilight of the snow-clad night attentively, he perceived that snow was still falling. He thought he could almost see the drifts rising higher against the outbuildings. 2 large barns stood behind the house. From these he judged that the fields around were farmed. It was considerations concerning the project of his journey the next day which made him look out, and also a restless curiosity regarding every detail of the menage, whose young mistress was at once so childlike and so queen-like. While looking out he had what seemed a curious hallucination of a dark figure standing for a moment on the top of the deep snow. As he looked more steadily the figure disappeared. All the outlines at which he looked were chaotic to the sight, because of the darkness and the drifting snow, and the light which was behind him shimmering upon the pane. If half a dozen apparitions had passed in the dim and whirling atmosphere of the yards, he would have supposed that they were shadows formed by the beams of his lamp, being interrupted here and there by the eddying snow where the wind whirled it most densely. He did not close his shutters. He even left his inner window partially open, because, unaccustomed to a stove, he felt oppressed by its heat. When he threw himself down, he slept deeply, as men sleep after days among snow-fields, when a sense of entire security is the lethargic brain's lullaby. He was conscious first of a dream in which the sisters experienced some imminent danger. He heard their shrieks piercing the night. He woke to feel snow and wind driving upon his face, to realize a half-waking impression that a man had passed through his room, to know that the screams of a woman's voice were a reality. As he sprang for his clothes, he saw that the window was wide open, the whole frame of the outer double glass having been removed, but the screams of terror he heard were within the house. Opening the door to the dark hall, he ran, guided by the sound, to the foot of the staircase which the girls had ascended, then up its long straight ascent. He took its first steps in a bound, but, as his brain became more perfectly awake, confusion of thought, wonder, a certain timidity because now the screaming had ceased, caused him to slacken his pace. He was thus hesitating in the darkness when he found himself confronted by Madge King. She stood majestic in grey woolen gown, candle in hand, and her dark eyes blazed upon him in terror, wrath, and indignation. It seemed for a moment she could not speak. Some movement passed over the white sweep of her throat and the full dimpling lips, and then, "Go down!" She would have spoken to a dog with the same authority, but never with such contemptuous wrath. "Go down at once! How dare you?" Abashed, not knowing what he might have done to offend, Courthope fell back a step against the wall of the staircase. From within the room Eliz cried, "Is he there? Come in and lock the door, Madge, or he'll kill you." The voice, sharp, high with terror, rose at the end, and burst into one of those piercing shrieks which seemed to fill the night, as the voices of some small insects had the power to make the welkin ring in response. Before Courthope could find a word to utter, another light was thrown upon him from a lamp at the foot of the stair. It was held by Jacques Morin, grey-haired, stooping, dogged. The Morin family, man, wife, and daughter, were huddling close together. They, too, were all looking at him, not with the wrath and contempt to which Madge had risen, but with cunning desire for revenge, mingled with the cringing of fear. There was a minute's hush, too strong for expression, in which each experienced more intensely the shock of the mysterious alarm. It was Madge who broke the silence. Her voice rang clear, although vibrating. "Jacques Morin, he came into our room to rob." She pointed at Courthope. The thin voice of Eliz came in piercing parentheses. "I saw him in the closet, and when I screamed he ran." Madge began again. "Jacques Morin, what part of the house is open? I feel the wind." All the time Madge kept her eyes upon Courthope, as upon some wild animal whose spring she hoped to keep at bay. That she should appeal to this dull, dogged French servant for protection against him, who only desired to risk his life to serve her, was knowledge of such intense vexation that Courthope could still find no word, and her fixed look of wrath did actually keep him at bay. It took him, by some sheer physical power which he did not understand, the courage with which he would have faced 100 Morins. When Jacques Morin began to speak, his wife and daughter took courage and spoke also. A babble of French words, angry, terrified, arose from the group, whose grey night-clothes, shaken by their gesticulations, gave them a half-frenzied appearance. In the midst of their talking, Courthope spoke to Madge at last. "I ran up to protect you when I heard screams. I did not wake until you screamed. Someone has entered the house. He has entered by the window in my room. I found it open." With his own words the situation became clear to him. He saw that he must hunt for the housebreaker. He began to descend the stairs. The Morin girl screamed and ran. Morin, producing a gun from behind his back, pointed it at Courthope, and Madame, holding the lamp, squared up behind her husband with the courage of desperation. It was not this fantastic couple that checked Courthope's downward rush, but Madge's voice. "Keep still!" she cried, in short strong accents of command. Eliz, becoming aware of his movement, shrieked again. Courthope, now defiant and angry, turned towards Madge, but, even as he waited to hear what she had to say, reflected that her interest could not suffer much by delay, for the thief, if he escaped, could make but small speed in the drifting storm over roads which led to no near place of escape or hiding. It was the judge's daughter which Courthope now saw in Madge, the desire to estimate evidence, the fearless judgment. "We took you in last night, a stranger, and now we have been robbed, which never happened before in all our lives. My sister says it was you she saw in our room. As soon as I could get the candle lit, I found you here, and Jacques Morin saying you have opened your window so that you would be able to escape at once. What is the use of saying that you are not a robber?" He made another defiant statement of his own version of the story. The girl had given some command in French to Morin. To Courthope she spoke again in hasty sentences, reiterating the evidence against him. Her manner was a little different now. It had not the same straightforward air of command. He began to hope that he might persuade her, and then discovered suddenly that she had been deliberately riveting his attention while the command which he had not understood was being obeyed. A noose of rope was thrown round his arms, and instantly tightened. With a nimbleness which he had not expected, Morin knotted it fast. Courthope turned fiercely. For a moment he struggled with all his force, bearing down upon Morin from his greater height, so that they both staggered and reeled to the foot of the stair. At his violence the voices of the Morin women, joined by that of Eliz, were lifted in such wild terror that a few moments were sufficient to bring Courthope to reason. He spoke to Madge with haughty composure. "Tell him to untie this rope at once. There is some villain about the house who may do you the greatest injury. You are mad to take from me the power of arresting him." Madame Morin, seeing the prisoner secured, hastened with her lamp to his bedroom. Madge, feeling herself safer now, came a little way down the stair with her candle. "How can we tell what you would do next?" she asked. "And I have the household to protect. It is not for myself that I am afraid." The anger that he had felt toward her died out suddenly. It was not for herself that she was afraid. She stood a few steps above him, her little candle, flashing its rays into the darkness of the upper and lower halls, made walls and balustrades seem vast by its flickering impotence to oust the darkness. Surely this girl, towering in her sweeping robe and queenly pose, was made to be loved of men and gods. Hero, carrying her vestal taper in the temple recesses, before even Leander had crossed the wave, could not have had a larger or more noble form, a more noble and lovely face. Well, if she chose to tie his arms, he would have preferred to have them tied, were it not for the maddening thought that more miscreants than one might be within reach of her, and that they would, if skilled, find the whole household an easy prey. Madame Morin came back from the room with the open window, making proclamation in the most excited French. "What do they say?" asked Courthope of Madge. The Morin girl was following close to her mother, and Jacques Morin was eagerly discussing their information. Madge passed Courthope in silence. They all went to the window to see. Courthope, following in the most absurd helplessness, trailing the end of his binding cord behind him, brought up the rear of the little procession. Madge walked straight on into his room, where Madame Morin was again opening the window shutters. "They say," said Madge to Courthope, "that you had an accomplice, and that he is gone again. They saw his snowshoe tracks." He begged her to make sure that the man was gone, to let him look at the tracks himself, and then to search the house thoroughly. Outside the window the same chaotic sweep and whirl of the atmosphere prevailed. It was difficult, even holding a lantern outside, to see, but they did see that a track had come up to the window and again turned from it. After that they all searched the house. Courthope allowed to be of the company, apparently because he could thus be watched. The thief of the night had come and gone. Some silver and jewelry which had been stored in a closet adjoining the bedroom of the sisters had been taken. Courthope understood very little of the talk that went on. At length, to his great relief, Madge gave her full attention to him in parley. "Won't you believe that I know nothing whatever of the doings of this sneak thief?" Some of her intense excitement had passed away, succeeded by distress, discouragement, and perhaps perplexity, but that last she did not express to him. She leaned against the wall as she listened to him with white face. "We never took in anyone we didn't know anything about before, and we never were robbed before," she added. "We treated you kindly. How could you have done it? If you did it—" his heart leaped at the "if," as if at a beam of sunshine on a rainy day. "You must have known all about us, although I can't think how. You must have known where we kept things, and that mamma had taken our other manservant away. You must have brought your accomplice to hide in the barn and do the work while you played the gentleman. That is what Jacques Morin says. He says no one but a child would have taken you in as I did, and that you might have murdered us all. They are very angry with me." There was conflict in her manner. A few words would be said haughtily, as to someone not worthy of her notice, and then again a few words as to a friend. He saw that this conflict of her mind was increasing as she stood face to face with him, and with that consolation he submitted, at her request, to be more securely bound, the rope twisted round and round, binding his arms to his sides. It was a girl's device. He made no complaint. It seemed that Morin had no thought of following the thief. His faithfulness was limited to such service as he considered necessary, and was of a cowardly rather than a valiant sort. Courthope, when his first eagerness to seek passed off, was comforted by reflecting that, had he himself been free, it would have been futile for him to attempt such a quest while darkness lay over the land in which he was a stranger. He was allowed to rest on the settle in the large inner kitchen, securely locked in, and so near Morin's room that his movements could be overheard. There, still in bonds, he spent the rest of the night. End of chapter 3. Section 20 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 4. When the March morning shone clear and white through the still falling snow, and the Morins began to bustle about their work for the day, the mental atmosphere in the kitchen seemed to have lost something of the excited alarm that had prevailed in the night. Courthope arose. The garments which he had donned in the night with frantic speed clothed but did not adorn him. He knew that he must present a wild appearance, and the domestic clothesline, bound round and round his arms, prevented him from so much as pushing back the locks of hair which straggled upon his brow. He was rendered on the whole helpless, however murderous might be his heart, a tolerable safe companion. He interested himself by considering how Samson-like he could be in breaking the cords, or, even tied, how vigorously he could kick Morin if he were not the girl's prisoner. He reflected with no small admiration upon the quick resource and decision that she had displayed, how, in spite of her almost childlike frankness, she had beguiled him into turning his back to the noose when a supposed necessity pressed her. He meditated for a few minutes upon other girls for whom he had experienced a more or less particular admiration, and it seemed to him that the characters of these damsels became wan and insipid by comparison. He began to have a presentiment that love was now about to strike in earnest upon the harp of his life, but he could not think that the circumstances of this present attraction were propitious. What could he say to this girl, so adorably strong-minded, to convince her of his claim to be again treated as a man and a brother? Letters? He had offered them to her last night, and she had replied that anyone could write letters. Should he show her that he was not penniless? She might tell him in the same tone that it was wealth ill-gotten. It was no doubt her very ignorance of the world that, when suspicion had once occurred, made her reject as unimportant these evidences of his respectability. but he had no power to give her the eyes of experience. These thoughts tormented him as he stood looking out of the window at the ever-increasing volume of the snow. How long would he be detained as a prisoner in this house, and, when the roads were free, how could he find for Madge any absolute proof of his innocence? The track of the midnight thief was lost for ever in the snow. If he had succeeded in escaping as mysteriously as he had come, but here Courthope's mind refused again to enter upon the problem of the fiend-like enemy and the impassable snowfields, which in the hours of darkness he had already given up, perceiving the futility of his speculation until further facts were known. Courthope strolled through the rooms, the doors of which were now open. Morin permitted this scant liberty, chiefly, the prisoner thought, because of a wholesome fear of being kicked. In the library at the back of the drawing-room he found amusement in reading the titles of the books down one long shelf and up another. Every book to which Madge had had access had an interest for him. 3 cases were filled with books of law and history. There was but one from which the books had of late been frequently taken. It was filled with romance and poetry, nothing so late as the middle of the present century, nothing that had not some claim upon educated readers, and yet it was a motley collection. Upon the front rim of the upper shelf some one, perhaps the dead father in his invalid days, had carved a motto with a knife, the motto that was also that of the British Arms. It might have been done out of mere patriotism. It might have had reference to this legacy of books left to the child maidens, for whom, it seemed, other companionship had not been provided. At length Courthope realized that there was one book which he greatly desired to take from the shelf. The Morin daughter was dusting in the room, and, with some blandishments, he succeeded in persuading her to lay it open upon the table where he could peruse it. To his great amusement he observed that she was very careful not to come within a yard or two of him, darting back when he approached, evidently thinking that the opening of the book might be a ruse to attack her by a sudden spring. At first the curious consciousness produced by this damsel's awkward gambols of fear so absorbed him that he could not fix his attention upon the book. Flashes of amusement and of grave annoyance chased themselves through his mind, like sunshine and shadow over mountains on a showery day. He knew not which was the more rational mood. Then, attempting the book again, and turning each leaf with a good deal of contortion and effort, he became absorbed. It was The Letters of a Portuguese Nun, and in the astonishment of its perusal he forgot the misfortune that had befallen the household, and his own discomfort and ignominy. The Morin girl had left him in the room, shutting the door. An hour had passed. It might have been around 9 of the clock, when Courthope began to be roused from his absorption in the book by a sound in the next room. It was a low uncertain sound, but evidently that of sobbing and tears. He stopped, listened. His heart was wrung with pity. It was not the sharp little Eliz who cried like that. He knew such sobs did not come from the stormy and uncontrolled bosoms of the French servants. He was convinced that it was Madge who was weeping, that she was in the long drawing-room where the portrait of the judge hung near the door. He went nearer the door. His excited desire to offer her some sympathy, to comfort, or if possible to help, became intolerable. So conscious was he of a common interest between them that not for a moment did the sense of prying enter his mind. He heard then a few words whispered as if to the portrait. "Father, oh, Father, we were so happy with him. It is almost the only time that we have been quite happy since you went away." The sense of the broken whispers came tardily to Courthope's understanding through the smothering door. The handle of the door was on a level with the hands that were bound to his sides. He turned himself in order to bring his fingers near it. Before he touched it he heard Madge's sob and whisper again. "I was so happy, Father. I thought it was such fun he had come. I like gentlemen, and we never see any except the ones that come out of books." To Courthope it suddenly seemed that the whole universe must have been occupied with purpose to bring him here in order to put an end to her gloom and flood her life with sunshine. The universe could not be foiled in its attempt. Young love argues from effect to cause, and so limitless seemed the strength of his sentiment that the simplicity of her mind and the susceptibility of her girlhood were to him like some epic poem which arouses men to passion and strong deeds. Ignominiously bound as he was, his heart lightened. All doubt of his mission to love her and its ultimate success passed from him. He turned the handle and pushed the door half open. The long drawing-room was almost dark. The shutters had not been opened. The furniture remained as it had stood when the brilliant assembly of the previous evening had broken up. The large fireplace was full of ashes. The atmosphere was deadly cold. Courthope stood in the streak of light which entered with him. Upon the floor, crouching, her cheek leaning against the lower part of her father's picture, was Madge King. She was dressed in a blanket coat. Moccasins were upon her feet. A fur cap lay upon the ground beside her. At the instant of his entrance she lifted her bare head, and across the face flushed with tears and prayers there flashed the look of haughty intolerance of his presence. She had thought that he was locked up in one of the kitchens. She told him so, intensely offended that he should see her tears. It was for that reason that she did not rise or come to the light, only commanding and imploring him to be gone. "I am quite helpless, even if I wanted to harm you," he spoke reproachfully, knowing instinctively that if she pitied him she would accept his pity. "You have harmed us enough already," she sighed. "All the rest of our silver, all my dear father's silver is gone. We found that out this morning. For what we had used for the feast had been put in a basket till we could store it away. It is all taken." He was shocked and enraged to hear of this further loss. He did not attempt to reason with her. He had ceased to reason with himself. "You trusted me when you let me in last night," he said. "Don't you think that you would have had some perception of it last night if I had been entirely unworthy? Think what an utter and abominable villain I must be to have accepted your hospitality, to have been so happy with you." So he went on appealing to her heart from the sentiments that arose in his own. Madge listened only for a reasonable period. She rose to her feet. "I must go," she said. He found that she proposed to walk on snowshoes 3 miles to the nearest house, which belonged to a couple of parish priests, where she would be certain of obtaining a messenger to carry the news of this robbery to the telegraph station. She could not be brought even to discuss the advisability of her journey. Morn could not be sent, for the servants and Eliz would go mad with terror if left alone. To Courthope's imagination her journey seemed to be an abandonment of herself to the utmost danger. If between the two houses she failed to make progress over high drifts and against a heavy gale, what was to hinder her from perishing? Then, too, there was that villain, who had seemed to stalk forth from the isolated house afar into the howling night as easily as the Frankenstein demon, and might even now be skulking near, a dangerous devil, able to run where others must trudge toilsomely. Madge, it seemed, had only come to that room to make her confession and invoke protection at the shrine of the lost father. She was ready to set forth without further delay. She would not, in spite of his most eloquent pleading, set Courthope at liberty to make of him either messenger or companion. "The evidence," she said sadly, "is all against you. I am very sorry." A wilder unrest and vexation at his position returned upon his heart because of the lightening that had come with the impulse of love. That impulse still remained, an undercurrent of calm, a knowledge that his will and the power of the world were at one, such as men only feel when they yield themselves to some sudden conversion. But above this new-found faith the cross-currents of strife now broke forth again. Thus he raged. "What was the use of my coming here? Why should the fates have sent me here if I cannot go this errand for you, or if I cannot go with you to protect you? If this beast is walking about on snowshoes, how do you know that he will not attack you as soon as you are out of sight of the house?" She seemed to realize that it was strange to be discussing her own safety with her prisoner. Very curious was the conflict in her face, her strong natural companionableness, her suspicion of him, and her sense of the dignity which her situation demanded, contended together. It seemed easier for her to disregard his words than to give all the answers which her varying feelings would prompt. She was tying on a mink cap by winding a woolen scarf around her head. Miss Madge, Miss King, it is perfectly intolerable. It is intolerable. He stepped nearer as he spoke. A thought came over him that even the conventional title of Miss, which he had given her, was wholly inappropriate in a situation so strong, that he and she, merely as man and woman, as rational beings, were met together in a wilderness where conventions were folly. I cannot allow you to risk your life in this way. There was a tense emphasis in his words. He felt the natural authority of the protector over the tender thing to be protected, the intimate authority which stress of circumstance may give. She dropped her hands from tying the scarf under her chin, returning for his words a look of mingled curiosity, indecision, and distrust. Quick as she looked upon him, his mind's eye looked upon himself. There he stood in grotesque undress, bound around with cords of an extraordinary disgrace. He blamed himself at the moment for not having had his hair cut more recently, for he knew that it stood in a wild shock above his head, and he felt that it dangled in his eyes. Then a gust of emotion, the momentary desire for laughter or groans of vexation, rose and choked his utterance, and in the minute that he was mute the girl, sitting down upon a low stool, began tightening the strings of her moccasins, which, after the first putting on, had relaxed with the warmth of the feet. Her businesslike preparations for the road maddened him. "Don't you see," he said, "what disgrace you are heaping upon me? What right have you to deny me, a gentleman and your guest, the right to serve and protect you? Consider to what wretchedness you consign me if I am left here. To think of you fighting alone with this dangerous storm, or attacked by blackguards, who we know may not be far away." She said in a quiet, practical, girlish way, "It was I who was responsible for letting you in last night, and then this happened, this most unheard-of thing. We never heard of any but a petty theft ever committed in this whole region before. Now I am bound to keep you here until we can hear where Father Silver is." "You don't believe that I have done it. I'm sure you don't." He believed what he said. "Why haven't you the courage to act upon your conviction? You will never regret it." "Eliz says that she saw you quite distinctly." "Eliz is a little fool," were the words that rose within him, but what he said was, "Your sister is excitable and nervous. She saw the thief undoubtedly, and by some miserable freak of fortune he may have resembled me." "Does that seem at all likely?" "Well, then there was no resemblance, and she fancied it." She stood up, looking harassed, but without relenting. "I must go. There is nothing else to be done. Do you think I would stay here when a day might make all the difference in recovering the things which belong to my father? Do you think I am going to lose the things that belong to him just because I am too much of a coward to go out and give the alarm?" She walked away from him resolutely, but the thought of the lost treasures and all the dear memories that in her mind were identified with them seemed to overcome her. She drew her hand hastily across her eyes, and then, to his dismay, the sorrow for her loss emphasized her wavering belief in his guilt. For the first time he realized how strong that sorrow was. Impelled by emotion she turned again, and came shrinkingly back into his presence. "I have not reproached you," she said, "because I thought it would be mean in case you had not done it. But it seems that you must have done it. Won't you tell me where the other man has taken our things? They cannot be of any value to you compared to their value to us. And, oh, indeed, I would much rather give you as much money as you could possibly make out of them, and more too, if you would only tell me which way this man has gone, and send word to him that he must give them back. I will pledge you my word of honour that—" For the first time he was offended with her. He stepped back with a gesture of pride, which in a moment he saw she had construed into unwillingness to give the booty up. "I could promise to give you the money. I could promise that you should not be tracked and arrested. I have enough in the savings bank of my own that I could get out without our lawyer or mamma knowing it, and you don't know how dear, how very dear, everything that belonged to father is to Liz and me. If you wait here tied until my stepmother comes, she will not give any money to get the things back. She would not care if you kept them, so long as she could punish you." Every word of her gentle pleading made the insult deeper and more gross, and the fact that she was who she was only made the hurt to his pride the sorer. He could not answer. He would not explain. He would let her think what she liked. It is the way of the injured heart. Angry, and confirmed in her suspicion, she too turned proudly away. He saw her, as she crossed the hall, take up a pair of snowshoes that she had left leaning against the wall, and without further farewell to anyone turn toward the front door. He knew then what he must do. Without inward debate, without even weighing what his act's ultimate consequences might be, he followed her. "I will do what you ask. I give you my word of honour, and there is honour, you know, even among thieves, that I will do all in my power to bring back everything that has been stolen. Give me snowshoes. Keep my horse and my watch and my luggage as surety that I mean what I say. I cannot promise that I will get back the silver from the other man, but I will do far more than you can do. I will do more than anyone else could do. If it is within my power, I will bring it back to you." She considered for a little time whether she would trust him or not. It seemed, curiously enough, that from first to last she had never distrusted her first instinct with regard to his character, but her childlike belief that in the unknown world all things were possible allowed her to believe also in his criminality. Now that he had, as she thought, made his confession and promised restitution, it was perhaps the natural product of her conflicting thoughts and feelings that she should trust to his oft-repeated vows, and make the paction with them. She did not consult the Morans. Perhaps she knew that she would only provoke their opposition, or perhaps she knew that they would only be too glad to get rid of the man they feared, caring for nothing but the actual safety of the lives of the household. She brought him his coat and cap, and also a man's moccasins and snowshoes. With a courage that, because somewhat shy and trembling, evoked all the more his admiration, she untied the first knot of his rope, unwound the coil, and then untied the last knot. The process was slow because of the trembling of her fingers, which he felt but could not see. She stood resolute, making him dress for the storm upon the threshold of the door. He did not know how to strap on the snowshoes. She watched his first attempt with great curiosity. Looking up, he was made the more determined to succeed with them by seeing the pain of incredulity returning to her eyes. "How do you expect me to know how to manage things that I have never handled in my life before?" "But if you don't know how to put them on, how can you walk in them?" "I've seen men walk in them, and there are a great many things we can do when something depends upon it." She directed him how to cross and tie the straps. She continued to watch him, increasing anxiety betraying itself in her face. The snow was so light that even the snowshoes sank some 4 or 5 inches. It was just below the porch that he had tied his straps, and when he first moved forward he trod with one shoe on top of the other. He had not expected this. He felt that no further progress was within the bounds of possibility. For some half-minute he stood, his back to the door, his face turned to the illimitable regions of drifts and feathery air, unable to conceive how to go forward, and without a thought of turning back. When his pulses were struggling and tingling with the discomfort of her gaze, he heard the door shut sharply. Perhaps she thought that he was shamming and was determined not to yield again. Perhaps, and this seemed even worse, she had been overcome in the midst of her stern responsibility by the powers of laughter. Perhaps, horrid thought, she had gone for Moran to bid him again throw the noose over his treacherous shoulders. The last thought pricked him into motion. By means of his reason he discovered that if he was to make progress at all the rackets must not overlap one another as he trod. His next effort was naturally to walk with his feet so wide apart that the rackets at their broadest could not interfere. The result was that in a few moments he became like a miniature Colossus of Rhodes, fixed again so that he could not move, his feet upon platforms at either side of a harbour of snow. He heard the door open now again sharply, and he felt certain, yes, certain, that the lasso was on its way through the air. This time he was not going to submit. As men do unthinkingly what they could not do by way of thought, he found himself facing the door, his snowshoes truly inextricably mixed with one another, but still he had turned round. There was no rope, no Morin. Madge was standing alone on the outer step of the porch, her face aflame with indignation. "This is either perfect folly, or you have deceived me," she cried. "I shall learn how to use them in a minute," he said humbly. He was conscious as he spoke that his twisted legs made but an unsteady pedestal, that the least push would have sent him headlong into the drift. "How could you say that you would go?" she asked fiercely. He looked down at his feet as schoolboys do when chidden, but for another reason. The question as to whether or not he could get his snowshoes headed again in the right direction weighed like lead upon his heart. "I thought that I could walk upon these things," he said, and he added, with such determination as honour flying from shame only knows, "And I will walk on them, and do your errand." With that, by carefully untwisting his legs, he faced again in the right direction, but, having lifted his right foot too high in the untwisting position, he found that the slender tail of his snowshoe stuck down in the snow, setting the shoe pointing skyward and his toe, tied by the thongs, held prisoner about a foot above the snow. He tried to kick, but the shoe became more firmly embedded. He lost his balance, and only by a wild fling of his body, in which his arms went into the air, did he regain his upright position. The moment of calm which succeeded produced from him another remark. "It seems to me that you have got me now in closer bonds than before." As he spoke he turned his glance backward, and saw that comment of his was needless. The girl had at last yielded to laughter. Worn out, no doubt, by a long-controlled excitement, laughter had now entirely overcome her. Leaning her head on her hand and her shoulders against the pillar of the porch, she was shaking visibly from head to foot, and the effort she made to keep the sound of her amusement within check only seemed to make its hold upon her more absolute. "I don't wonder you laugh," he said, feebly beginning to laugh a little himself. But she did not make the slightest reply. Her face was crimson. The ripples of her laughter went over her form as ripples of wind over a young tree. He was forced to leave her thus. By a miracle of determination, as it seemed, he freed his right shoe and made slow and wary strides forward. He saw that he had exaggerated the width of his snowshoes, but his progress now was still made upon the plan of keeping his feet wide apart, although not too wide for motion. He knew that this was not the right method. He knew that she peered at him between her fingers and was more convulsed with laughter at his every step. He was thankful to think that the falling flakes must soon begin to obscure his figure, and he did not dare to try another plan of walking while she watched, lest she should see him stop again. End of chapter 4. Section 21 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 5. Courthope had struck across the main road at right angles to the Poplar Avenue. The poplars stood slim, upright, more like a stiff and regular formation of feathery seaweed growing out of a frozen ocean than like trees upon a plain. He was nearing a grove of elm and birch which he had not seen the evening before. By the almost hidden rails of the fence there were half-buried shrubs. So dry, so hard, so absolutely without bud or sere leaf was the interlacing outline of the trees and shrubs that they too seemed to be some strange product of this new sort of ocean. They did not remind him of verdant glades. Not that beauty was absent, nor charm, but the scene was strange, very strange. The domain of the laughing princess, on whom he had turned his back, was, in the daylight, more than ever an enchanted land which he could fancy to be unknown in story and until now unexplored by man. Such ideas only came to him by snatches. The rest of him, mind and body, was summed up in the fierce determination to catch the thief and bring back his spoils. Whether by this he would prove himself honest or guilty, he neither knew nor felt that he cared. Gradually, as he thought less about his snowshoes, he found that the wide lateral swing which he had been giving to his leg was unneeded. Strange as it seemed, the large rackets did not interfere when he took an ordinary step. Having made this pleasant discovery, he quickened speed. He did not know whether the girl had stopped laughing and had gone into the house again, but he knew that the falling snow and the branches of the trees must now hinder her from seeing him distinctly. In a moment he was glad of this, for, becoming incautious, he fell. Both arms, put out to save himself, were embedded to the very shoulder straight down in snow that offered no bottom to his touch. When his next impulse was to move knees and feet, he found that the points of his snowshoes were dug deep, and his toes, tied to them, held the soles of his feet in the same position. What cursed temerity had made him confess to a criminal act in order to allow him to come on this fool's errand? Fool, indeed, had he been to suppose that he could walk upon a frozen cloud without falling through. Such were Courthope's reflections. By degrees he got himself up, but only by curling himself round and taking off his snowshoes. By degrees he got the snowshoes put on again, and mounted out of the hole which he had made, with snow adhering to all his garments, and snow melting adown his neck and wrists. He now realized that he had spent nearly half an hour in walking not a quarter of a mile. With this cheerless reflection as a companion he went doggedly on, choosing now the drifted main road for a path. Having left behind him the skeleton form of the trees, he trudged across an open plain, flat almost as the surface of the lake which he had traversed yesterday. Sometimes the fences at the side of the roads were wholly hidden. More often they showed the top of their posts or upper bar. Sometimes he could see cross fences, as if outlining fields, so that he supposed he still walked through lands farmed from the lonely stone house, that he was still upon his lady's domain. He meditated upon her, judging that she was sweet beyond compare, although why he thought so, after her mistrust and derision, was one of those secrets which the dimpled Cupid only could explain. He was forced to acknowledge the fact that thus he did think, because here he was walking, whither he hardly knew, battling with the gale, hustled roughly by its white wings, in danger at every turn of falling off the two small moving rafts of his shoes into a sea in which no man could swim very long. He wondered, should his snowshoes break, if he would be able to flounder to the rim of the fence? How long could he sit there? Certainly it would seem, looking north and south and east and west, that he would need to sit as long as the life in him might endure the frost. At length, a shed or a small barn met his eye. His own approach seemed to have been heard and answered from within. The neigh of a horse greeted him. At first he supposed that some horses belonging to the house were stabled here, and neglected because the roads were impassable. Then he judged that so slight a shed could not be intended for a stable. He answered the animal's cry by seeking the door. Against it the drift was not deep, for, as it opened on the sheltered side, he had only the snowfall to scrape away. The door, which had very recently been freed from its crust of frost, yielded easily. He found a brown shaggy horse tied within, and beside it a sleigh, such as he had frequently seen, a mere platform of wood upon runners. Otherwise the shed was empty. Courthope was quickly struck by the recognition of something which set his memory working. The old buffalo skin on the sleigh was such as was common, but the way it was stretched upon a heap of sacks made him remember the sleigh that he had yesterday passed upon the river, and the keen sinister face of the driver, which had ill contrasted with his apparent sleep and stupidity. Courthope tossed aside the skin with a jerk. A rum bottle, a small hoard of frozen bread and bacon, a heavy blanket folded beneath, all seemed to prove that the driver had made provision for a longer journey. The horse had no food before it, no blanket was upon its back. Probably its driver had not intended to leave it here so long. Where was the driver? This quickly became in Courthope's mind the all-important question. Why had he been skulking on the most lonely part of the lake? And now, recalling again the man's face, he believed that he had had an evil design. Courthope pursued his way, for, whether the thief had gone farther or remained in its vicinity, it was evidently desirable to have help from the nearest neighbours to seek and capture him. Courthope soon reached what seemed to be a dip or hollow in the plain. In this the wind had been very busy levelling the surface with the higher ground. At first he supposed that, for some reason, the road and fences had come to an abrupt ending. Then he discovered that he merely walked higher above the natural level. The thought came to him that if he should here break his snowshoes, there would not be even the neighbouring fence-top on which to perch and freeze. Suddenly all his attention was concentrated on a dark something, like a bit of cloth fallen in the snow. As he came close and touched the cloth, he found it to be the covering of a basket almost buried. Pushing away the snow-crusted covering and feeling with eager fingers among the icy contents, he quickly knew that this was no other than the stolen silver of which he was in quest. A thrill of gratitude to fortune for so kindly a freak had hardly passed through his mind before his eye sought a depression in the snow just beyond. He saw now that a man was lying there. The head resting upon an arm was but slightly covered with snow. The whole form had sunk by its own heat into a cavity like a grave. Courthope lifted the head. The face was that of the man whom he had seen yesterday upon the river. The arms, when he raised them, fell again to the snow like lead. Yet he perceived that life was not extinct. Even in the frost the odour of rum was to be perceived, and breath, although so feeble as to be unseen, still passed in and out of the tightly drawn nostrils. The touch, that would have been reverent to a corpse, was now rough. He shook the fallen man and shouted. He raised him to a sitting posture, but finding that, standing as he did upon soft snow, to lift him was impossible, he laid him again in the self-made grave. That posture, at least, would be the most conducive to the continued motion of the heart. Standing upon the other side of the body, Courthope's shoe struck upon another hard object, which he found to be a case, stolen locked as it was, which contained, no doubt, the other valuables whose loss Madge had first discovered. The wretch, weighted by a burden in each hand, had apparently missed his way when endeavouring to return to the shed in which he had left his horse, and wandering in circles, perhaps for hours, had evidently succumbed to drink and cold, caught as in a trap by the unusual violence of the storm. There was nothing to be done but to return to the house for Moran's aid, and, lifting the handles of basket and case in either hand, Courthope doubled back upon his own track, thankful that he had already attained to some skill in snowshoeing. As he neared the house his heart beat high at the excitement of seeing Madge's delight. He closely scanned the windows, even the tiny windows in the pointed tin roof, but no eager eyes were on the lookout. Loudly he thumped upon the heavy front door. There was somewhat of a bustle inside at the knock. The snow-bound household collected quickly at the welcome thought of a message from the outside world. When the door was opened, Madge and the Morans were there to behold Courthope carrying the plunder. He perceived at once that his guilt, if not doubted before, was now proved beyond all doubt. There was a distinct measure of reserve in the satisfaction they expressed. Madge especially was very grave, with a strong flavour of moral severity in her words and demeanour. Courthope explained to her that the other man was dying in the snow, that if his life was to be saved no time must be lost. She repeated the story in French to Morin, and thereupon arose high words from the Frenchman. Madge looked doubtfully at Courthope, and then she interpreted. It seemed that the Frenchman's desire was to put him out again and lock up the house, leaving the two accomplices to shift for themselves as best they might. Courthope urged motives of humanity. He described the man and his condition. At length he prevailed. Madge insisted that if Morin did not go she would. In a few moments both she and Morin were preparing to set out. It seemed useless for Courthope to precede them. He went into the dining-room, demanding food of Madame Morin. He found that Eliz had been carried down and placed in her chair in the midst of domestic activities. As soon as she spied him, being in a nervous, hysterical state, she opened her mouth and shrieked sharply. The shriek at this time had more the tone of a child's anger than of a woman's fear. With a strong sense of humour he sat down at the table, and she, realizing that he was not imminently dangerous, railed upon him. "Viper in the bosom!" said Eliz. Courthope, almost famished, ate fast. "Daughter of the horse-leech crying, 'Give!' and sucking blood from the hand it gives," she continued. "Sir Charles Grandison would never have kicked a man when he was down," he said. "He would have tried to do good even to the viper he had nourished." The memory of Sir Charles's well-known method, even with the most villainous, appeared to distract her attention for a moment. "And then they all sent for him and confessed and made amends, just as I have done," Courthope went on. But the fact that a laugh was gleaming in his eyes enraged the little cripple. "How dare you talk to me, sitting there pretending to be a gentleman?" "I would rather be allowed to make a better toilet if my reputation were to rest upon a pretence. I never heard of a gentlemanly villain who went about without collar and cuffs, and had not been allowed access to his hairbrush." "A striped jacket and a shaved head is generally what he goes about in after he's unmasked. If I had been Madge, I would not have let you off." "Come, remember how sorry Elizabeth Bennet was when she found she had given way to prejudice. If I remember right, she lay awake many nights." "Are you adding insult to injury by insinuating that either of us might bestow upon you—" "Oh, certainly not. I merely wished to suggest that a young lady possessing lively talents and remarkably fine eyes might yet make great mistakes in her estimate of the masculine character." The cripple, who perhaps had never before heard her one beautiful feature praised by masculine lips, was obliged to harden herself. "Accomplished wretch!" she cried, in accents worthy of an irate Pamela. "Do you suppose it was the last time I was serving my term in jail that I read our favourite novels?" he asked. By this time Morin had passed out of the door to put on his snowshoes, and Courthope, who had swallowed only as much food as was necessary to keep him from starvation, turned out to repeat the process of putting on his, this time more deftly. Morin had a toboggan upon which were piled such necessaries as Madge had collected. They began their march 3 abreast into the storm. They went a long way without conversation, and yet Courthope found in this march keen enjoyment. His heart was absurdly light. To have performed so considerable a service for Madge, now to be walking beside her on an errand of mercy, was as much joy as the present hour could hold. It was difficult for him to keep up with the others, yet in doing so there was the pleasure of the athlete in having acquired a new mastery over his muscles, and the fascination of being at home in the snow as a sea-bird is at home in the surf, which is the chief element of delight in all winter sports, was his for the first time. With the drunken wretch who was almost frozen he felt small sympathy, but he had the sense that all modern men have on such occasions, that he ought to be concerned, which kept him grave. The other two were not light-hearted. Morin, dragging the toboggan behind him and walking with his grey head bent forward to the gale, was sullen at being driven in the service of thieves. Afraid lest some sinister design was still intended, he cast constant glances of cunning suspicion at Courthope. As for Madge, she appeared grave and preoccupied beyond all that was natural to her, suffering, he feared, from the pain of her first disillusionment. This was a suffering that he was hardly in a position to take seriously, and yet his heart yearned over her. He thought also that she was pondering over the problem of her next responsibility, and the evidence of this came sooner than he had expected. When they got to the place where his first track diverged straight to the shed, she and Morin stopped to exchange remarks. They evidently perceived in this the clearest evidence of all against him. Had he not gone straight to the place where the accomplice had agreed to wait? Then Madge fell back a little to where he was now plodding in the rear. She accosted him in the soft tones that had from the first so charmed him, contrasting with her sister's voice as the tones of a reed pipe contrast with those from metal, or as the full voice of the cuckoo with the shrill chirp of the sparrow. The soft voice was very serious, the manner more than sedate, the words studied. I am afraid that nothing that I can say will persuade you to alter a way of life which you seem to have chosen, but it seems to me very sad that one of your ability should so degrade himself. She stopped with a little gasp for breath, as if frightened at her own audacity. Her manner and phrases were an evident imitation of the way in which she had heard advice bestowed upon vagrant or criminal by the benevolent judge whose memory she so tenderly cherished. It was second nature to her to act as she fancied he would have acted. Courthope composed himself to receive the judicial admonition with becoming humility. His whole sympathy was with her. His mind was aglow with the quaint humour of it. You must know, rebuked Madge, how very wrong it is, and it is not possible that you could have difficulty in getting some honest employment. It is very kind of you to interest yourself in me. He kept his eyes upon the ground. I do not know, of course, what led you to begin a life of crime, or in what way you found out what houses in this country were worth robbing, but I fear you must have led a wicked life for a long time. She was very severe now. You are young yet. Why should you carry on your nefarious schemes in a new country, where, if you would, you could easily reform? Again a little gasp for breath. I have promised to let you go without giving you into the hands of the law. I am afraid I did a selfish and weak thing, because others may suffer from your crimes, and I wish you could take this opportunity which my leniency gives you, and try to reform before you have lost your reputation as well as your character. It is very kind of you, he murmured again, and still as he walked he looked upon his feet. He had no thought now of again denying his guilt. Having denied and, as she thought, confessed, he felt that to change once more would only evoke her greater scorn. Let be, his heart said. Let come what will. I will not confuse her further to-day. End of chapter 5. Section 22 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 6. They passed the shed, making a straight march, as swift as might be, for the fallen man. But before they reached him they saw someone coming, a black, increasing form in the snowy distance. Morin hesitated. If the thief had arisen, strong and able-bodied, it was clear that they had again been tricked for an evil purpose. Even Madge looked alarmed, and they both raised a halloo in the patios of the region. The answer that came across the reach of the storm cheered them. The newcomer, a messenger from the nearest village, became voluble as soon as he was within speaking distance. He addressed Madge in broken English, but so quickly and with so strong a French accent that Courthope only gathered part of his errand. He had come, it seemed, from the stepmother to tell something concerning a certain Xavier, who had been sent to them the evening before. Before he had finished calling, Madge and Morin had come to the place where the thief lay, and, looking down upon him, Madge gave a little cry. The newcomer came up. He looked as if he might be of the grade of a notary's clerk or a country chemist. He did not seem surprised to see who the man was. He began at once with great activity to chafe his hands and face with handfuls of the snow. Madge and Morin were also active with the restoratives. The thief was lifted and laid upon the toboggan. They trod the snow all about to know that nothing remained, and found only a corkless flask containing a few drops of rum. They were all so busy that Courthope had little to do. He stood aside, wondering above all at the way they rubbed the man with the snow, and at the astonishment that Madge expressed. The stranger was very nimble and very talkative, pouring out words now in French to Madge. He walked with her in all haste to the shed from which the horse again whinnied. Morin, awakening to a sense of urgency, started at a trot, dragging the toboggan behind him. It sank heavily in snow so light. Courthope lent a hand to the loop of rope by which it was drawn. He, too, essayed the trot of the Canadian. He was growing proficient, and if he did not succeed in keeping up the running pace, he managed to go more quickly than before. They made fair progress. Looking back, Courthope saw Madge and the stranger emerge upon the road with the little horse. He had not time to look back often to see how they helped it to make its way. They were still some distance behind when he and Morin reached the house. The man called Xavier was carried into the kitchen amid wild exclamations from the Morin women. As they all continued the work of restoring him with a hearty goodwill and an experience of which Courthope could not boast, he was glad to betake himself to his own room, wondering whether he was now a thief or a gentleman in the eyes of this small snow-bound world. There was, in any case, no one at leisure to prohibit him from making free with his own possessions. When he was dressed, a certain shyness prohibited him from entering the dining-room in which he heard Madge, Eliz, and the stranger talking French together. He betook himself to the library, to the letters of the Portuguese nun, and an easy-chair. They might oust him with severity, but it was well to enjoy a short interval of luxury. The room was warmed with a stove. The book was in the old-fashioned type. An almost sleepless night was behind him. Soon he slept. It was almost midday when he slept. The afternoon was advancing when he awakened. Madame Morin was standing beside him arranging a tray of food upon the table. "Eh?" she said, and smiled upon him. Then she pointed to the food, and demanded in pantomime if it suited him. Courthope concluded that he had ceased to be in disgrace. He would rather, much rather, have been summoned to a family meal, but that was not in his lot. He had taken many things philosophically in the course of recent hours, and he took this also. What right had he to intrude himself? He ate his meal alone. His roving glance soon brought him pleasure, for he found that some one had tiptoed into the room while he slept, and laid the choicest volumes of romance near his chair. The wind had dropped, the snow had ceased falling. Before Courthope had finished his luncheon, the young man who looked like a notary's clerk came in, using his broken English. He remarked that the storm was over, and that they were now going to get out a double team to plough through the road. He suggested that Courthope should help him to drive it, and to transport the prisoner to the jail in the village. One man must be left to protect the young ladies and the house. One man must help him with the team and its burden. The speaker shrugged his shoulders, suggesting that it would be more suitable for Morin to remain, and said that for his part he would be much obliged and honoured if Courthope would accompany him. Here some plain and easy compliments were thrown in about Courthope's strength and the generous activity he had displayed, but not a word concerning his temporary disgrace. If this man knew of it, he did not regard it as of any importance. He was a matter-of-fact young man, not much interested in Courthope as a stranger, immensely interested in the fact of the theft and all that concerned it. At the slightest question he poured out excited information. Xavier had been a servant in the house. Mrs. King, who was religious and zealous, had found in him a convert. He had become a Protestant to please her. At this point the narrator shrugged his shoulders again. Then Xavier had asked higher wages. Upon that there was a quarrel, and he had left. The speaker's scanty English was of the simplest. He said, "Xavier is a very bad man, much worse than our people usually are. This winter he went to the city and got his wits sharpened, and when he came back he made a scheme. He sent word to Mrs. King that his old father was dying, and would like to be converted too. Mrs. King travels at once with a horse and the strongest servant-man. The old father takes a long time to die, so Xavier comes here yesterday to say she will stay all night, but when he did not come back, his wife soon got frightened, and she told that the old man was not going to die, and that she was afraid there was a scheme. Now we have Xavier very safe. He may get 5 years." Upon Courthope's inquiring after the health of the thief, he was told that beyond being severely frostbitten, he was little worse. He was again drunk with the stimulants that the Morins had poured down his throat. The visitor ended the interview by saying that if Courthope would be good enough to drive the team through the drifts, his own horse and sleigh would be sent after him the next day. Courthope inquired what was the wish of the young mistress of the house. The other replied that Mademoiselle approved of his plan. It was evident that poor Madge was no longer the mistress. The clerk was an emissary of Mrs. King's, and as such he had taken the control. Still, as he was an amiable and capable person, Courthope fell in with his suggestion, inwardly vowing that soon of some domain, if not of this one, Madge should again be queen. Courthope received a message to the effect that the young ladies wished to see him. There was something in the formal wording of this message, coming after his solitary meal, which made him know that they were ill at ease, that they had taken their mistake more deeply to heart than he would have wished. He had no sooner entered the room where Madge stood than he wished he were well out of it again, so far did his sympathy with her discomfort transcend his own pleasure at being in her presence. Madge stood, as upon the first night, behind her sister's chair. Eliz looked frightened and excited, yet as half enjoying the novel excitement. Madge, pale-faced and distressed, showed only too plainly that she had need of all the courage she possessed to lift her eyes to his. Yet she was not going to shirk her duty. She was going to make her apology, and the apology of the household, just as the judge, her father, would have wished to have it made. It was a little speech, conned beforehand, which she spoke, a quaint mixture of her own girlish wording and the formal phrases which she felt the occasion demanded. Courthope never knew precisely what she said. His feelings were up and in tumult, like the winds on a gusty day, and he was embarrassed for her embarrassment, while he smiled for the very joy of it all. Madge confessed with grief that Eliz had mistaken Xavier for Courthope. She said the man from the village had shown them what folly it was to suppose that the gentleman could be Xavier's accomplice. She begged that same gentleman's pardon very humbly. At the end he heard some words faltered. She wished it was in their power to make any amends. Almost before she ceased speaking he took up the word, and his own voice sounded to him merry and bold in comparison with her soft, distressful speech. But he could not help it. He must speak with such powers as nature gave him. There are two ways by which you can make amends, and first, I would beg that none of our friends who were here last night should be told of it. I should not like to think that Emma and Elizabeth, and Evelina or Mariana Alcoforado should ever hear that I was taken for a thief. You are laughing at us, said Eliz sharply. We know that you will go away and make fun of us to all your friends. If I do, you will have one way of punishing me that would give me more pain than I could well endure. You can shut me out next time I come to ask for shelter. Oh, but you can't come again, said Eliz, with a vibrating note of fierce discontent. Our stepmother will be here. He looked at Madge. I was going to say that the other way in which you could make amends would be to give me leave to come back, and if you give me leave I will come, even if it be necessary, to that end, to get an introduction from all the clergy in Great Britain, or from the royal family. A ray of hope shot into Madge's dark eyes. The first glimmer of a smile began to show through her distrust. It is an old adage that where there is a will there is a way. And did I not walk on your most impossible snowshoes and bring back your silver? Madge looked down. A pretty red began to mantle her pale face, and, as if the angels who managed the winds and clouds did not wish that the blush of so dear a maiden should betray too much, a ray of scarlet light from the sinking sun just then came winging through the dispersing storm clouds, and caused all the white snow world to redden, and dyed the frost flowers on the window-pane, and, entering where the pane was bare, lit all the room with soft vermilion light. So, in the wondrous blush of the white world, the girl's cheeks glowed, and yet did not confess too much. You will allow me to send in your compliments, and inquire after Mr. Woodhouse as I pass. This was Courthope's farewell to Eliz, and she called joyfully in reply. You need not send back his message, for we shall know that they are all very indifferent. Into the scarlet shining of the western sun, an omen of fair weather and delight, Courthope set forth again from the square tin-roofed house, leaving, as the saying is, his heart behind him. The large farm horses, restive from long confinement and stimulated by the frost, shook their bells with energy. The Morin women displayed such goodwill and even tenderness in their attentions to the comfort of the second prisoner, in whom they had found an old friend, that, tied in a blanket and lying full length on the straw of a box sleigh, he looked content with himself and the world, albeit he had not as yet returned from the happy roving places of the drunken brain. The talkative clerk was glad enough to give Courthope the reins of the masterful horses. He sat on one edge of the blue-painted box, and Courthope on the other. Thus they started, bravely plunging into the drifts between the poplars. The drifts were all tinged with pink. The poplars, intercepting the red light upon their slender upright boughs, cast, each of them, a clear shadow that seemed to lie in endless length athwart the glowing sward. Courthope looked back at the house which had been so dim and phantom-like the night before. The red sun lit the icicles that hung from eaves and lintels, tinged the drifts, glowed upon the windows as if with light from within, and turned the steep tin roof into a gigantic rose. But all his glance was centred upon his lady love, who stood, regardless of the cold, at the entrance of the drift-encircled porch, and watched them as long as the sunlight lay upon the land. Was she looking at the plunging sleigh and at its driver, or at the chasms of light in the rent clouds beyond? His heart told him, as he drove on into the very midst of the sunset which had embraced the glistening land, that the maid, although not regardless of the outer glory, only rejoiced in its beauty because the vision of her heart was focused upon him. His heart, in telling him this, taught him no pride, for had he not learned in the same small space of time only to count himself rich in what she gave? Slow was the progress of the great horses. They passed the grove of high elms and birches that, dressed in the snowflakes that had lodged in boughs and branches when the wind dropped, stood up clear against the gulfs of blue that now opened above and beyond. Then the house was hidden, and after that, by degrees, the light of the sunset passed away. The End. End of Chapter 6 of A Freak of Cupid, and The End of A Dozen Ways of Love, by Lily Dougall.